interrupts first.
And I have twins,
So yeah, so do I. So are your twins also 7 by chance?
29,
Yeah, 29.
and I lived through it. So
I was going to say, you made it further than I
Yeah.
wonder if I might. Yeah.
I have 4 kids total. So at any rate.
Yeah. God bless you. All right.
Recording's all set.
Perfect. Thank you. So kind of our table of contents here. Hopefully I can stick to this and get through it all. Anytime I'm giving a longer format presentation, I feel like, oh, this is going to be great. I have all this time to dig into everything. And then I get anxiety that I don't have enough to fill the time. There's no way to accurately predict it because we don't know where our conversations are going to go. But I will do my best to get through all of it, and I'll watch my own time. If we do need breaks throughout the day, I don't know if I mentioned that, feel free to get up, use the bathroom, get a snack, interrupt me, ask for everyone to take a break, whatever we need. So first up, I'll give you a little background about me. Then I will go into the what and why of macro. Why should you care about all this that we're talking about today? My macro gear, again, macro gear in general. I'm going to talk about magnification, which I find really important when kind of setting the stage for a presentation about macro. I'm going to show some aperture comparisons and talk specifically about how aperture applies to macro photography, which may be a little bit different than you're used to thinking about it. Real quick on lighting, because we have more time, I don't have a ton of slides on lighting, but I can talk about it a little bit, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get there. Some time on nailing focus, because focus is more critical in macro than probably any other type of photography. Camera settings, and I will very explicitly on a silver platter serve you my settings. Now, my settings may not be perfect for you, but you are welcome to copy them. One of the most common questions that I get is, what are your settings? And I'm happy to share them, but it's also kind of a funny question because, believe it or not, there's more to making a photo than having your camera set the right way, right? But people love it and you're welcome to have them. And then sample photos. I think I put about 15 into this presentation. I never know if people want to see any or if they want to see 100. Depending on where we're at time will determine how long I spend on each, but I can tell you the full backstory of any photo. I can tell you the specifics of what I was thinking, how I achieved the shots. So we'll go through a bunch of those, and then that will segue into image processing, which is more of a series of before and afters, where I will show what came out of the camera and then my finished result. And I can go into actually showing you in Lightroom or Photoshop how to do some things if we care or if there's time, but that's not the plan right now. So definitely interrupt and ask if you have questions about that, but I'll do more of kind of showing and explaining rather than full-blown demonstrations for those, because that could take quite a while and I don't know that it's necessary. And then my top 10 tips for macro, which I did prepare a document for download for this group. I made a special link, which will be available for the next 24 hours, and you can download that PDF. Again, this is just for you, so don't go putting it up on Facebook and saying, look what I got, but you can give it to the other members of EPP. Focus, bracketing, and stacking. I literally gave a 3-hour workshop on the content that's in that bullet point. So that's why I don't feel there's any problem filling this time if I start to get ahead of myself, which I probably won't because I tend to talk a lot about any given thing. But that's going to be the big chapter, right? And that's why it's italicized. That's why I saved it for the end. And then Q&A. But again, Q&A along the way. So before I get into telling you all about me for 5 minutes, does anyone have any questions now? Okay. So there I am. Chris McGinnis, born and raised in Brick, New Jersey. I've lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for the last 24 years, which is now more than half my life. And I ended up here in Bethlehem when I attended Moravian College. So I got to Moravian in 1999, and I have been here ever since. As I mentioned, I've worked at Olympus since 2007, and my job at Olympus is creative director. So I was hired as a graphic designer in 2007. Over the years, things change, responsibilities increase, And now I oversee all photo, video, graphic and web design for Olympus in the Americas. And that is mainly the medical business. So for those of you that don't know or didn't hear me at the beginning, Olympus is a fairly large player in the medical device industry. If anyone was responsible enough or of the age to have a colonoscopy, that was Olympus. So 90% chance. If you went to a reputable facility, it was an Olympus scope. We make the best there is. We also make the most expensive scopes. So that's the only time where people don't use Olympus scopes. But colonoscopy is kind of the backbone of our business, and then countless other medical devices in the portfolio. I began photography quite a while ago, but it got more serious in the last 8 to 10 years, and then specifically for macro about 6 or 7 years ago. So I have several film cameras. I have, maybe I can show them if you can see me. I mean, I have shelves up there on the wall with, I probably have about 50 or 60 cameras in my collection, but I started with film in high school. I was an art major in college and, ultimately got my degree in graphic design, but I had photography classes, and I was in school at a time where photography was still taught in a traditional sense. So I was able to take photos on black and white film, develop them in a dark room, make my prints with enlargers. And I feel like that fundamental experience was really valuable. So some of you may come from that era and may have that experience as well. And I feel really old to say it this way, but it's like kids these days miss out on that experience, right? Like they're spoiled by digital, but that foundational knowledge is really valuable. And then kind of stepped away from it for a while. And then once I was hired by Olympus, I all of a sudden had access to camera equipment, and I was able to borrow cameras for free, and I was able to use things before the public knew they existed. And that was really cool. And kind of got more into photography. And then in 2016, things really kicked up and I kind of got consumed by it. And then one bullet point that I skipped over earlier there is, as of earlier, or about a year ago now, in early 2022, I was invited to become an OM System ambassador. So again, OM System is the name of the Olympus consumer brand. It's a rebranding after the corporate changes. The corporation Olympus sold the camera business. The camera business became OM System, but it's really the same products. Ton of the same people work there. They bought all the patents. They bought the factories. Like, it's the same thing. And it was really cool for me because for 15 years, I had been very involved with Olympus cameras and the marketing of Olympus cameras. I had worked on countless campaigns. Photo behind me, if you can see, there's a poster up here. So I was on location. I took that photo in British Columbia. I was involved in all the photo shoots in the studio, all the design, the current getolympus.com I designed, right? So lots of involvement. And then the business was sold and I wasn't going to work with them anymore. So that was a real bummer. As soon as the deal was settled, they contacted me and said, hey, even though we don't work together anymore, we'd love to partner with you and have you be an ambassador. So that's my backstory. If anyone has any questions about that, you can ask now or later, and I could give you a 4-hour presentation about myself. But that is not what you're here for today. We are here to talk about macro. So what is macro? This is actually a more complicated answer than it might seem, but I never know how technical or how nitpicky the people in the audience are going to be. So I want to clarify that I certainly know what it is. I will speak about it in looser terms. Macro photography is extreme close-up photography, usually of very small objects like living organisms, such as insects, in which the size of the subject in the photograph is greater than life size. And I will be talking about life size quite often, and a ratio of 1:1. And that is typically what is considered macro. When the photo is the same size as the subject is in real life, and the photo being at the size of the sensor. I'm going to get into the details about that. We'll talk about magnification, but that ratio of real life size to size on the sensor being equal or greater on the sensor than it is in real life, that's macro photography. That said, I will loosen my definition and the way that I talk about it during this presentation, and I will call any close-up macro-ish photography macro. Right? We're just using it kind of as a broader, looser term. But if you want to be technical or specific, that's where we're at. Why macro? I do not know any of you beyond the last 15 minutes, but I am sure that not all of you are dedicated macro photographers. Some of you may have dabbled, some of you may be serious, and some of you may have never shot a macro photo in your life. So why should you care? Why should anyone care? Now, for me, it's all about field macro. It's going out, finding subjects, learning about them, discovering things. Almost every time I go out, I find something new, or I see something new, or in a new way that I haven't seen before. And that's exciting to me. And then it's exciting for me to have that brief relationship with a subject, to capture the photo before the insect flies away, to just find something that I've never seen before, and then go online, look it up, look in field guides, learn all about it, and then share that with everyone else. Because if it's interesting to me, I hope it's interesting to someone else. So that's for me. But why should anyone or everyone care, right? Like, what's the benefit to all photographers regardless? And this is probably the most text-heavy slide in the whole presentation. I will spend a few minutes here. I adapted this information from a photographer, a former Olympus ambassador as well, Robin Wong. You may know who he is. He has a pretty popular channel on YouTube, and he did a video about this. But in summary, or in what I find to be the most relevant, you can learn and master the basics. And that sounds very obvious. You should learn and master the basics regardless of what type of photography you're into. But understanding aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and the distance from your subject, which actually is kind of this fourth wild card, become really, really important in macro. And then you can apply that to anything. It doesn't matter if you're a wedding photographer, a landscape photographer, sports, or anything else. You can take those basics and apply them elsewhere. Speaking of basics, achieving critical and sharp focus, there is nowhere to hide in a macro photo. You need to get it sharp. And it's actually pretty hard. So the practice with macro then makes focusing on bigger subjects that are further away, or maybe more forgiving, much easier. But if you kind of approach those other subjects the same way that you get used to approaching them with macro, your results tend to be better. That sharpness tends to kind of penetrate through other forms of photography. And then learning flash operation and light control. The flash is really scary for a lot of people. I don't know if everyone here has used a flash or is comfortable using a flash, but for a lot of photographers, they're like, oh, I'm a natural light photographer. And a lot of people that say it because they don't know how to use flash, or they don't know how to use lights or control light. And natural light's great, right? It's probably the preference when it's available and it's nice, but it's not always available and it's not always nice, especially with macro, because when you're in the field, I'm crawling around on the ground, I'm under branches, I'm, in the woods where there's not good sunlight, or the light is too harsh because it's the middle of the day, or there's no light at all because it's night. So we have to bring our own light. And for that, I use a flash, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But again, once you learn how to use a flash for macro, you can start to realize how you would use it. And I really consider the photography that I do to be kind of like tiny portraits. And the principles are the same, right? I'm just doing it on a much smaller scale, but I can go into the studio and really apply the same fundamentals. All right, on to the next one. Like I said, there's a long list, but I really want everyone to understand this because yes, you're here, so you took that step, but if you had any doubt that this might be applicable to you, this should convince you. So building shooting discipline. Produce results that are in line with the results that you intend to capture. You should be deliberate about what you're doing. Macro is not about spraying and praying. You don't just hit the button and hope that you get what you want. No photography should be about spraying and praying. Sports photography, a lot of times that phrase is used where the action's happening and you just point your camera at it and hope you get what you wanted to get. But if you can really think about it, if you can dial yourself in and deliberately attempt your shots, you are going to have better results. And that's really valuable. It's a valuable skill that transfers to all photography. Speaking of intentionality, achieving the intended results in camera. So this is something that I really learned from another former Olympus ambassador, who's a fantastic commercial photographer named John Sterling Ruth. And I've worked with John for over 15 years now and been on location with him all over North and Central America, actually. Getting it right in the camera. So we live in an age where we have lots of software that can save photos, fix photos. Let's look at that software as enhancing our photos and getting the photo as good as possible in the camera, because then you can push it further in post. You don't want to use post to save your photo. You want to get it right in the camera. So you can do that with macro, you can do it otherwise. And then on that same topic, minimize the need for heavy post-processing. Leave the software to do the things that really make your, take it from good to great, not from okay to good. The next one is near and dear to my heart and one that I need to remind myself of all the time. Developing patience. Appreciate the effort and energy involved to get just a few photos. And there are all kinds of statements out there about the ratio of how many keepers you get per session. For every hour of photography, you walk away with one, or for every 1,000 you get one, or every 100 you get one. But don't expect every click of the shutter to be great. And as you get better, the photos that you used to think were great aren't great anymore, right? Your standards are raised. And having that patience to accept that you're not going to nail every shot is really important, no matter what you shoot. And slowing down physically and mentally, I'm going to say this probably a few times today, are critical. With macro, because the subjects are so small, if you're talking about field subjects, you're going to miss them. You're not going to miss the shots only, but you're going to not find them, right? You have to move slowly to notice them. And then when it comes time to make your photos, moving slowly physically is going to yield better results, right? There's going to be less camera movement. You're less likely to scare your subjects, all these things. So just kind of slowing down and accept that you'll miss opportunities. It's really easy to get frustrated when you see a subject that you've only seen in pictures, and now there it is in front of you for the first time, and you bend down, you go too fast, you scare it away, or it was just time for it to fly onto whatever it was doing next, and you miss the shot. And then you're all bummed and you pout for 20 minutes. And in that 20 minutes, you missed 20 opportunities. So getting to a mental place that you will miss opportunities, it's more about the experience than it is about the output. It's really going to improve everything for you. And then last but not least, understanding your gear. This is another thing that people take for granted. I can't even venture a guess on how many times I've read questions on Facebook groups and different forums, people asking questions where the answers are in the manual. Read your manual, okay? The manufacturers of cameras typically do a very good job of documenting every little detail about their equipment. I know they can be confusing, they can be in-depth, they can be really long, but they've got all the answers. So first thing you do when you get a new piece of equipment, typically a camera in particular, read about it. Save the PDF to your phone. Most manuals are available as a PDF download. Save it to your phone. So when you're out on location or out in the field somewhere, you can reference it, you can read it. But also read through that manual to look for things that are going to be applicable to the type of photography you do. So we're talking about macro today, but this applies to anything. Things like focus stacking, focus bracketing, focus peaking, magnification, all of these things are very specific to a type of photography. Learn how to get to them in the menus, learn where they are. And then the more you know your gear inside and out, the better photographer you're going to be, because then you're spending less time confused or not knowing how to do something, or you can more quickly get to settings, or you can take advantage of settings that maybe you didn't even realize were there. And that's all going to help you. And you can determine what works best for you. So there are a million ways to do any number of things when it comes to photography, and knowing what the options are, trying those options is really important so you can figure out what works. Okay, so before I get into my gear, does anyone have any questions about that? I know that was a lot with no visuals, so it may have felt boring for a few minutes there, but is everyone doing okay? Good, I see thumbs, love it. All right, my gear. Some people love this section. Some people don't care because they already have all their gear, but let's go through it and see where you fall. In order to capture the intricate details of macro subjects, I utilize a combination of a powerful and lightweight camera system, specialized optics, and various diffusion materials. So first up, can't take a photo without a camera, okay? So I've got it right here, if you can see me. This is my camera. So it's the OM1. The OM1 came out in February of 2022. It is the follow-up to the OMD EM1 series. So if anyone happens to be familiar with Olympus products, there was the EM1, EM1 Mark II, EM1 Mark III, and EM1X. This is essentially the EM1 Mark IV, right? So it's the first camera under the OM system badge. And it is called the OM1, a throwback to the 70s with the Olympus OM1. And this is the flagship currently. So it is super compact, has amazing weather sealing, which I could not have more trust in. Amazing image stabilization in the body, tons of great features specifically for macro, which of course we're going to get into. And if you're familiar with those EM1 cameras, if you haven't seen the OM1, it's very, very similar in ergonomics and in cosmetic, but really kind of takes all the features up a notch, and especially the speed, autofocus speed, processing speed, etc. Next up, the Mzuiko 60mm macro, f2.8 60mm macro. So for scale, if you can see me, very tiny lens. One of the advantages of the OM system of Olympus cameras is the size, and that does come into play. And I will try, not to come off as salesy for OM system. It's just what I have the most experience with. But there are specific advantages for macro, because small and lightweight is great when you're out in the field, right? Like, you don't want to be lugging extra stuff. You don't want to be weighed down. The heavier your gear, the shakier you are. It's harder to hold. The harder it is to get your balance or get into situations. So small is really valuable with macro, and the 60 is like crazy tiny. It's what I take probably 90% of my photos with for the last 5 years. It's capable of reaching 1-to-1 magnification, as is true macro. But because of the 4/3 sensor, which I'll get into lots of detail in a little bit, it's actually the equivalent of 2-to-1. So if you have a full frame camera and shoot 1-to-1, this is actually 2-to-1. But that might not make sense to you right now. It will shortly. My flash is the FL700WR. This is a very traditional flash. Not that there's nothing special about it, but it's pretty much like any other flash that you would buy, right? So if you shoot Nikon or Canon, or you use Godox or any other flash manufacturer, they're going to do the job. The specific flash that I use is made by Olympus. It does have a couple of small advantages, mainly that it's weather sealed. So all three products that are up on the screen right now, I can take out in absolute pouring rain and not worry about anything. So that's really nice because if I'm out somewhere, it might start raining, or if there's a threat of rain, I don't have to worry. So that's probably the biggest advantage over other flashes. And then pro tip, if you don't have a weather seal flash and you want to go out in the rain, you can use non-lubricated condoms, which typically you can get from medical supply companies. So they're used for like ultrasound wands, and you can stretch that over your flash, and they're white and translucent and actually act as a bit of diffuser, completely seal your flash, and then you just throw it away when you're done, move on. So pretty easy way to weather seal any flash. And then not a macro lens. So this falls into that category of not true macro, but the 40-150 Pro, which again is pretty compact. So if you can see me, here it is in my hands. This is the 40-150 Pro. Because this is a micro 4/3 lens, it's the equivalent of 80 to 300 millimeter on a full frame camera. It's pretty big reach. And I'm not really relying on the reach as much as I am the close focusing capability. So this lens can focus from about 1 meter away, so say 3 feet. And for subjects like butterflies or dragonflies, where they're a little larger, so I don't need as much magnification, but they're also pretty skittish, especially in midday. I can get pretty nice butterfly, dragonfly photos with the 40-150. And honestly, when I'm out in the wild, maybe I find a bird that I want to photograph. You know, like even though I'm there for macro, it's nice to have that lens on hand. And again, all weather sealed, so no worries there. Okay, diffusion. So again, if you can see me, just what's up on the screen. Excuse me. Diffuser. So that's my Cygnus Tech macro diffuser. This is handmade by a fellow macro photographer named Brendan. He lives in Australia. He has painstakingly prototyped for years to get to this design. It folds up flat, which I really like. I can put it in my backpack. I can have it with me all the time. It sets up in a matter of 15, 20 seconds. It's all made out of some sort of plastic composite. So again, the weather doesn't affect it at all. And it does a really nice job for providing simple, aesthetically pleasing, diffuse light for macro subjects. And for anyone that doesn't understand why we need a diffuser, 1 second so I can clear my throat. Much better. Why do we need a diffuser? So again, to use that studio analogy, if you've ever had a headshot taken, or if you've taken headshots, you've worked in a studio, there's all kinds of light modifiers, right? We've got snoots and grids and softboxes and all different things that can modify the light. Well, the light coming from a flash or from any light source, whether it's a strobe in the studio or anything else, the sun, can be harsh, right? That direct hit of light, it's going to be kind of targeted. It's going to be harsh in the center and softer on the edges. And with macro photography, with a typical shoe-mounted flash like I'm using, we're going to be really close to our subject with the light, and that light is going to hit the subject kind of full blast. And what tends to happen is you get hot spots, you get dark shadows. It doesn't look great. A lot of subjects are shiny, right? So beetles and things, they're very shiny. And this spreads out the light, it softens the light, and you get much more graduated light to dark. You don't get that really bright spot where the flash hit the hardest. And the shape of this diffuser creates kind of a nice catch light, and you'll see that in spider shots later on. Next up, the homemade option. So if you want the Cygnus Tech diffuser, you can click on link on my website to email Brendan and tell him that you're interested. But I don't even know what it costs. Honestly, probably like $150 or something, which on one hand sounds like a lot because he's making it by hand, but on the other, he literally makes diffusers like 10 hours a day. It's his full-time job. It's really successful. He's just like got lightning in a bottle with this thing. People love it. On the other, it's right. Like, you don't have to do it yourself. But if you want to play arts and crafts, I highly recommend it, actually. So the diffuser on the left, it's, I think, behind me somewhere, maybe you can see it. But it's a miniature softbox that I made myself. It's cardboard, gaff tape, white non-woven polypropylene fabric. If you don't know what that is, think of like reusable shopping bags that you would get at the grocery store, like that kind of, it's like meshy but not so porous. You can literally cut up a white shopping bag, or you can buy it for just a few dollars on Amazon or Fabric Store, but really readily available. It's used for packaging a lot. And I just kind of measured it out to my flash. I kind of set the angle, and again, trial and error a bit. But the reason I recommend this is you start to learn. If you just buy something and it works, that's great, but you don't necessarily understand how it's working. Now, if you make something or you experiment with different materials, I'm using this white non-woven fabric, but maybe use tissue paper, or tracing paper, or vellum, or paper towels, or any other material that's translucent white, you start to see what materials produce the results that you like, how much light transmission different materials have, when one layer works better than 2 layers or 3 layers or whatever, the distance, the angle. So you start to really figure out what works the best for what you want to achieve. And then here's another packing material. I have one here as well. I've made several of these over the years. So it's just a piece of packing foam. It's about 3/8 of an inch thick. It's cut into this shape. There's an elastic band on it, a cutout for the flash, literally free. Okay, so you can get this out of a package that will probably come to your house this week with some delivery, and you can make that yourself. It works surprisingly well. I have made some photos that I'm very happy with using that type of setup. If it gets damaged, make another one. No big deal. So if nothing else, definitely try to do something like that. Of course, there are commercially available options. You can go, you guys are in Vermont, so maybe to Hunt's, or you can go online to B&H, or you can you go to Amazon and you can search macro diffusers, and there's lots of options. But quite honestly, I haven't found any or heard of any that are any better than what's up on the screen right now. And the Cygnus Tech is probably most expensive. There's also the AK diffuser, the MK diffuser, the Pope Shield diffuser. Those are all like other homemade options where people have developed them, but they're all kind of similar to Cygnus Tech, and I would assume similar in price. And then 2 additional items that I have here, and these you may be familiar with if you have dabbled in macro at all. We've got the Raynox DCR 250, and we've got extension tubes. And the brand, this is FACA, but they can be any extension tubes. So they work quite differently, but the results are quite similar. So the Raynox DCR 250 is essentially a fancy magnifying glass that goes over your lens. Okay, so if you can see me, take a look. If not, no big deal. The Raynox just clips onto the end of the lens and adds magnification. What's cool about the Raynox, and why I prefer it over instead of extension tubes, it's really easy on and off. You don't have to take your lens off. You don't have to expose your sensor to the elements. You don't have to fumble around 2 hands. You can just clip it on the end of your lens, and it's instant magnification, instant satisfaction. Some people will say that, well, you're adding another glass element to the equation. It could degrade your image quality. I do not find it to really degrade image quality to a level that bothers me. It's also pretty inexpensive for what it is. I think they're about $80. And it works on virtually any lens from any system. So you can add magnification to any lens that's in your bag. So say you're like, yeah, I saw that guy talk about macro on Sunday. No way I'm going to go spend X number of dollars on a new macro lens because I don't care that much, but it would be nice to try it. Well, I can buy this thing and I can do some macro. So really kind of cheap, easy way into macro, or the way that I use it is to magnify a macro lens even further. So you get additional magnification beyond what the macro gives you natively. Extension tubes, on the other hand, while they can also be used with virtually any lens, just make sure you get the right size for your lens mount. So if you have a Canon EF mount or 4/3 mount or whatever, you just need to get the right ones, and they're available for every system. You put these spacers, and you can combine. So there's 2 shown there. You could use 1, you could use 3. Typically, they're sold in pairs. They increase the distance of your lens glass from the sensor. And as the lens glass moves further from your sensor, magnification increases. And we can think about that when we talk about telephoto lenses that extend, right? So if you twist the barrel of your telephoto lens, the glass goes out, it's further from the sensor, the image is magnified larger on the sensor. The extension tubes are doing just that. Some extension tubes, better extension tubes, have electronic contacts in them. If you get extension tubes that don't have contacts, you will lose the ability to autofocus and probably change your aperture. But if you get tubes with the contacts, you'll be able to still control everything and use your autofocus. What's nice also about extension tubes is they don't have any glass in them. They're just spacers. So while there is a risk of some light loss because you're putting more connections in between, there's no loss of image quality, because whatever quality your glass is on your lens, you're getting the full benefit of that, where with the Raynox, you are introducing additional glass. So I'll show some comparisons in a few minutes about the magnification. They're really, really similar, but each kind of has its advantages. But for me, because of the speed and ease of the Raynox, I tend to use that more. And then real quick on software, everyone wants to know what software everybody uses. There's tons of options. I've been using Photoshop for, I don't know, 2/3 of my life, most days of my life. Very comfortable with Photoshop, very comfortable with Lightroom. I have access to them. So they're my choice. Does that make them the best? Not necessarily. I mean, you could use Capture One, or you could use Olympus Workspace, or whatever your manufacturer uses. You could use free software. There's tons and tons of options here, but these are what I use. And on the right, Helicon Soft's Helicon Focus. That is very specialized software. Relative to the other softwares, I guess reasonably inexpensive. I think it's like $150, but it does one thing. It does that one thing really well. It focus stacks images, but it's very purpose-built software. I understand that everyone will not want to spend extra money to focus stack, but you may have Photoshop. So when we get to focus stacking, I'm going to show you several ways to achieve it, and both with Photoshop and with Helicon Focus will be demoed. And if you have any other interest in the gear that I use, these are kind of the highlights, the ones that really matter. But everything that's in my bag, everything that I utilize is kind of listed and detailed on my website. So chrismcginnis.com/gear. If you do decide to buy anything, click my affiliate links. I get like a nickel for every purchase. So it all adds up. Any questions about gear before I go to magnification? No? Okay. Magnification. This section is very important. it may be a little confusing. Since we do have some time, I encourage you to interrupt me after I finish this chapter and ask, right? Like I want to make sure you really get this. So I already talked about images being called macro if the ratio of the subject size to the sensor size equals or is greater than 1. So 1:1, 2:1, 5:1, those are macro. 1:2 would not be considered macro technically, but it's fine for the sake of today's conversation. So let's look at how magnification impacts output and then how it can be beneficial or detrimental to the results. This slide exists in many forms. If you were to Google sensor size comparison, you'll see very similar things to this. This I made to be what I felt to be the clear representation and the most relevant for the most people. So the 3 most popular sensor sizes in the camera industry for consumer grade cameras are full frame, APS-C, and 4/3. So the most popular now in 2023 is probably full frame. Most manufacturers that make full frame cameras also offer APS-C cameras. APS-C tend to be a little more affordable. And then 4/3, and there's a couple of manufacturers, actually more than a couple. There's what's called the 4/3 consortium. I think there's like 15 manufacturers that make products with 4/3 sensors. But the big players are Olympus/OM System, Panasonic, Blackmagic makes 4/3 products. But all it means is different sensor sizes inside the camera. So in order to create an image, your photo utilizes a sensor, and the sensor size directly impacts the magnification. So a full frame sensor, full frame's camera sensor, is roughly the same size as a piece of film, right? So 35 millimeter camera. So you've got 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and even though it's probably not accurate in size on your screen, these are to scale. So if you look from left to right, full frame's the biggest, 4/3 is the smallest. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see that 4/3 is almost exactly half the size of full frame. And that's going to be important, right? That half size. Somewhere in between, and the reason there's an asterisk there, is each manufacturer's APS-C sensor is like a tiny bit different. So I think I've chosen 1.5 times here. So it fits halfway between full frame and 4/3. But if you shoot with an APS-C camera, you might have to check your manufacturer and say, like, what is that multiplier? It might be 1.4, 1.6, or it might be slightly different, but roughly 1.5. So you'll hear this term crop factor. And what that means is it's all based on the standard of a full frame sensor. That's 1x. If you have a 4/3, or camera with a 4/3 sensor, that's 2x. Because the sensor's half the size, the output is doubled. And that can be beneficial and detrimental. So for me, obviously, I worked for Olympus. I worked with Olympus. I had access to Olympus products, right? So like there was an easy kind of bias toward that gear to begin with. But there's a specific benefit for macro. In macro is all about magnification, and magnification is doubled on 4/3. So that's an advantage. Also, depth of field is doubled on 4/3. So with macro, and the reason we focus stack is we want more depth of field, I get double the depth of field without having to change my aperture to double or half. So there's some specific advantages, but just to be fair, 4/3 isn't better for everything. The sensor is smaller, therefore it collects less data. So theoretically speaking, a full frame sensor can collect more data and therefore provide you higher resolution and maybe higher dynamic range. So it's all about finding the right balance between the features that matter to you, and that's kind of how you would choose your camera system. Most of you probably have your own camera system already. Maybe you're not in the market for a new one, but Those are the things you would want to think about. But back to magnification specifically, we often hear about crop factor when talking about telephoto. So I mentioned my 40 to 150 lens. That long end is 300 millimeter equivalent. So we'll talk about full frame equivalent or 35 millimeter equivalent. And that's just because full frame terms are more standard. And sometimes it's confusing for people to say, oh, you have a 40 to 150 millimeter lens. That's not that much reach. And you have to say, well, actually, it's the equivalent of 300. So it's just a way to speak in even terms. So we're used to hearing it in telephoto, but the same goes for macro. But instead of saying my 60 millimeter lens is the same as 120 millimeter lens, we usually talk about the doubling of magnification because the magnification matters more than the focal length. So I took these sample shots of pennies, and I'm going to use pennies for the next several slides to show, because I think everybody knows how big a penny is, right? So it's hard to understand magnification if you don't know how big the thing is. And that's actually confusing a lot of times because people will see my photos or any macro photos of live subjects that they're unfamiliar with, and they have no idea how big or small that subject is. They'll see a spider and they'll be like, oh my God, how big was that? That's terrifying. And I'm like, I don't know, the size of a big grain of sand. Like, and they're like, oh, I thought that was like the size of your hand, because they have no frame of reference. But we all know how big pennies are. So if you were using a macro lens capable of 1:1 on a full frame camera, that's what the pennies would look like, right? Because a penny is about 19 millimeters wide. The sensor is about 36 millimeters wide. So you're seeing the penny and then some. That's as zoomed, it's not really zoomed, that's as magnified as you could get. With an APS-C sensor camera, you get the sense of being a little closer, right? Because the sensor is a little smaller. And then we'll focus more on the 4/3 sensor because it's double the full frame. The penny is 19 millimeters wide. As sharp, as big as I can get and still be in focus is what you see here. The entire penny almost, because the penny's slightly larger than the sensor. That's 1:1, okay? So 1:1 is the relative scale of the subject to the sensor. The magnification may be different than the scale depending on what size sensor you have. This makes very good sense to me, but I've been doing it for a long time. So does it not make sense to anyone? Okay. I will be explaining it much more in depth in a minute, but hopefully everyone's still with me. All right, so the top left corner, that is my 60 millimeter macro, and I'm going to show you different levels of magnification and what they mean. So this may not be perfect. This is hand-drawn graph paper and handheld samples that I shot myself, but the boxes are 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. So the sensor's 17.5, 18 millimeters wide. So what is that? Times 4, 72 boxes, more than that, 76 boxes wide. But the idea is this is 4 times larger than the sensor. Okay, so 1:4. My subject is 1. My subject is 1. Sensor is 4, right? Saying that right? Subject. Yeah, subject's 1, sensor is 4. Oh, 68 millimeters. I have it right there. What does that mean? That's what you get. At 1:4 magnification, that's what you get. You do not have to think about the magnifications when you're shooting necessarily. There can be benefits to it, but you should understand what it means, right? So like, oh, this is 1:4 magnification. Other lenses are going to have the max magnification. You can understand what that means. If I were to move closer to achieve 1:2 magnification, now this is my field of view. It's half of 1:4. The pennies look like that. I'm going to skip over this one because the math's confusing. 1-to-1 magnification, so 17 or so millimeters field of view. This is the actual size of my sensor in real life. So this is as if I took the sensor out of my camera, put it on the table, took a photo of it. It's the exact size 1-to-1. My subject is 17 millimeters wide. My sensor is 17 millimeters wide. It looks like that. So that's as magnified as I can get with the 60 millimeter macro on its own. If this was a full frame camera and I did this exact same series of demo, you would see twice as much in the frame. So this is actually something, if you're familiar or kind of thinking in terms of full frame versus 4/3, it's important because while my camera is 20 megapixels, you might have a full frame camera that's 40 megapixels. In order to get the same magnification, you have to crop halfway. So essentially, you're left with 20 megapixels on the full frame camera also. So it's not like, oh, well, I've got 40 megapixels, I can just crop in. Well, yeah, but you're throwing away half the pixels to get the same result. So it's not as much better as maybe it seems. And then for additional magnification, I want to show you what it looks like. And as you can see in the two images on the right, so the center and the furthest to the right, those are shot with the Raynox added and with extension tubes added. The field of view is really, really close, maybe a tiny bit more magnification from the extension tubes. Any image quality difference is really from my own error in focus, not from the products. I mean, and they're pretty close anyway. But this kind of goes back to what I was saying when I was comparing the Raynox to the extension tubes. Either one is going to result in more magnification. So it's a preference. I like to add the Raynox because it's easier and faster, but extension tubes are just as good, if not theoretically better, because there's no extra glass there. But that's the difference. So you can see it is, to me, worth having that $80 accessory in my pocket if I want more magnification. Just pop it on and I can get it. So cheap, easy way to get more. Of course, that said, it doesn't replace a true macro lens. And I'm going to talk about that later. Like when engineers are specifically manufacturing something to work for macro, it's going to be better, but this is a pretty good substitute. Okay, so that's it about magnification. Does anyone have anything? I can only see some of you, so definitely speak up if you have a question.
I have a question, but I feel
Yes.
like it should be obvious. I just can't wrap my brain around it.
No problem.
So when you had the comparisons with the lines, were you changing your distance to the subject or your aperture?
Yeah, great question. Not particularly obvious. So the notion of magnification with macro can be confusing, especially if you're used to zooming in and out, right? So most of us have a telephoto lens with a zoom range on it, and I stand here, my subject's over there, I want to get closer, I zoom in. With macro, you have a fixed focal length, and if you want to zoom in, you move closer and adjust focus. So the maximum magnification on a macro lens, we'll call it 1-to-1 because that's typical. The maximum magnification is equal to the closest working distance in which you can achieve focus. So if you set your lens to 1-to-1, like the 60 macro has a shortcut on it to say, I want 1-to-1. Then I move my lens in as close as I can until it loses focus, and then back out that tiny bit to get focus. So here, I was manually setting the lens to 1-to-1 in this case, 1-to-2 in this case, etc., and then moving until I got there. And because it was accurately done, reasonably accurately done, I get the right number of boxes on the screen. So good question. It's actually going to come up during focus bracketing as well, but you asking it now is going to give everyone that frame of reference later.
Thanks.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay. Aperture comparisons. So this is one where I'm going to take a leap and assume that most of you understand what aperture is. I may speak in terms that are too basic for some of you, so don't be offended. But aperture is the hole that the light comes through in the camera, right? Big aperture, small number, f1.8, f2.8, something like that. Wide, big aperture, a lot of light comes through, brighter image, less depth of field, meaning less in focus. Small aperture, small hole, big number, f16. The light is coming through directly, therefore more depth of field, more in focus. So that's kind of a basic principle. Maybe I said it in a way that resonates with you more than you knew already. If so, great. If you already knew it, that's fine too. But it's a little bit different, or you think about it a little bit differently, works the same way with macro. Because while it's still light coming through your lens, impacting depth of field, with macro, we really need to pay attention to our distance from the subject, or at least consider it more, maybe not pay attention to it more. Because the factor that we often forget about when talking about aperture, we always remember the size of the hole goes bigger or smaller. As the hole gets bigger, depth of field gets smaller. As the hole gets smaller, depth of field gets bigger, greater. But the other part of that equation is as distance from subject decreases, so does depth of field. And as distance from subject increases, so does depth of field. Well, with macro, we're really close physically. So what you may think of as in your head, you're like, I know what f1.8 looks like. I know what f8 looks like. Well, maybe you're thinking in terms of portraiture, or you're thinking in terms of some other type of photography that you're used to. But with macro, oftentimes people are shocked at how small depth of field is. So I have some examples. So here is a water droplet on the end of a blade of grass. This is f2.8. So that's the maximum aperture, the largest aperture that my macro lens shoots at. Most macro lenses are f2.8 to f4 as a maximum aperture. Almost nothing is in focus. Now, that background bokeh, super smooth and creamy, right? That's always desirable. But there's almost nothing in focus. Like even in the droplet, just a tiny bit in the center is in focus, maybe in the refraction, but the blade of grass is basically all out of focus. The second droplet's definitely out of focus. So this isn't really all that usable. Also, it was really hard to achieve even what you see here in focus at f1.8, 2.8 rather. So here we go to f8. Now, some of you may think, I've never shot at f8 in my life. Who shoots at f8? You got to shoot at f1.8. Like that's where the good photos live. Well, with macro, you need to shrink the aperture down in order to get depth of field, unless you're focus stacking, but we're not there yet. So here at f8, you can see that the droplet and the refraction within the droplet is all super sharp. And hopefully that comes through on the screen share. I never know what you're seeing on the other end, but you still get really nice bokeh in the background. By all counts, I would consider that pretty smooth and creamy and defocused and not distracting, aesthetically pleasing. You get some of the blade of grass toward the tip in focus. So it's like, this is kind of where I'd want to be for a shot like this. Now at f16, which again, you might think you can't shoot at f16. That's, no man's land up there. The background's still pretty defocused. Like if I hadn't told you everything I told you and you had no experience with macro and showed you this shot, there's no way you would say this is at f16. You'd be like, oh, that's what, f4? I don't know. Like I know about bokeh. Well, this is f16 when you're 3 inches away, because everything's compressed. The background does get a little bit distracting for my tastes here at f16, but I am able to get more in focus, right? So everything's super sharp. Even the blade of grass, the second droplet is almost totally sharp. So you're getting a lot more depth of field, but I say a lot relative to the other two examples. The depth of field, what's actually in focus here, is still maybe 0.5 centimeter. Like it's not a lot. So if you compare that to a portrait, where at f1.8, you might be able to get from nose to ear in focus. So, how deep is that? 6 inches. At f1.8, here you're getting half a centimeter at f16. So there's a dramatic change. Oh, and I don't know if anybody noticed and I'm only saying this because I'm proud of the visualization. Top left corner. So that's what the aperture looks like in your camera. Then it shrinks down to f8 and then shrinks down to f16, right? So tiny hole, more depth of field, straighter lines of light. Open the aperture back up. So same example, just showing you in a different way. Laying in my backyard, taking these example shots. This is a very, very tiny mushroom. And at f2.8, I'm not going to claim that this is a bad photo. Maybe this is exactly what you want, but I want you to understand the impact of the settings on the output. And the impact of f2.8 here is only the front lip of that mushroom cap is in focus. Just that bit. So if that's what you want to isolate and that's what you want people to see, go ahead, open up to f2.8. But if you want more of the cap in focus, you're going to have to close down the aperture. So here's f8. So now I get most of the cap in focus. I start to see some of that texture from the top. I start to see the stock a little bit more. I kind of get this big bokeh ball in the background, which is kind of nice. It's still pretty soft. It's pretty defocused really at f8. And then at f16, I would consider this background to start being distracting, but you still have bokeh at f16. And that, again, can be pretty surprising for people. But the stock is almost in focus. The cap is almost entirely in focus. So this is a way to achieve more focus. Little bit of jump ahead to focus stacking. If you want to achieve the look of that background with that subject, that's when we focus stack. Okay, so we're going to get to that. I'm going to show comparative examples, but it's kind of this best of both worlds solution. And then here's the comparisons up on the screen together. And I just want to point out, my camera is a Micro Four Thirds camera. It's got the 4/3 sensor. As I mentioned, depth of field is double what you would experience from a full frame sensor. So if you're shooting with, I don't know, a Nikon Z9 and you've got a full frame sensor, you're going to have half the depth of field that you see in these results. So actually more extreme. Okay, so your f16 shot is going to look like my f8 shot. So probably surprising. I always think this is surprising to people. Does anyone have any questions about it before we move on to lighting? Okay. And we're about an hour and 30 minutes in right now. There's lots more to go. Like I said, focus stacking is going to take a long time. Does anyone want to take like 3-minute break before I get into lighting? Is that good? Sure. Okay. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second and do this. Hold on. I want to see you all again. Okay. So before we take that break, does anyone have any questions? Because like I know the presentation's down. Maybe it's easier to ask a question now, or we'll take a break for 3 minutes and come back.
I'll throw one at you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking about apertures. Do certain lenses have better sweet spots in macro? As an example, like mine could go to 32, but I feel like it's more accurate.
So
Closer to 16.
I would say not a better sweet spot, but I would say sweet spots vary per lens, and they're typically at the center of the range. So my lens goes from f2.8 to f22, and the sweet spot is around f8. So they're usually like in the middle. So you'll see when I get to my camera settings shortly that my default setting for macro is f8, and I go up or down from there as needed. but I know that I'm in the sweet spot, and that's going to give me kind of the sharpest or predictably sharp results anyway. Now you can't always shoot at the sweet spot. And for anyone that doesn't know that concept of sweet spot, basically lenses get sharper toward the middle of their aperture range. And really good, really premium expensive lenses tend to have more forgiveness in the range. So a really premium lens, they might be advertised as an f1.4 lens that has incredible sharpness even at f1.4, right? That's what the manufacturer is always trying to shoot for. Where a cheap kit lens that came with your camera and is worth $50, it's only good at the sweet spot. And then also we'll get into this when we talk about focus bracketing and stacking. One of the other concerns about, Jamie, you mentioned shooting at f32 or even shooting at f16 or above, there's this concept of diffraction. And that is basically image quality degrading as the aperture gets smaller. So you don't want to shoot at those really tiny apertures as a solution to getting more depth of field, because you could actually be compromising sharpness.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, so it's 10:31 right now. Let's call it 10:35. We'll resume, and I'll see you then. Before we get going again, did anyone attend any CCC this year in Massachusetts? No.
What do you mean by CCC?
New England Camera Club Council.
Oh,
It was at UMass in Amherst in July.
hmm.
I presented there, so I did. So if you were there, a lot of this content would be familiar, but I'm definitely going a little deeper now, was more surface level with them. So I was just wondering. It's a big event though. Unfortunately, so they've done it for the last 75 years, and this was the last one. So, but it's a lot of older people that are organizing it, and they're just not able to do it anymore. And nobody wants to pick up the reins, and that's how it goes.
It's kind of cool to have slipped in and say
Yeah.
that you were one of the last.
I know it's like bittersweet. It's cool to be
Sure.
part of it. Also, while I have the chance to ask you all now, has anyone on this call done much macro in the past, or is this all kind of new for you?
I've done some.
Some?
Yeah, worked with flowers mostly.
Yeah, flowers are, I consider pretty different than what I do, mainly because what typically makes a really nice flower photo is a lot of setup, because the flower's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So with me, it's all about how do I maximize my 2 seconds that I have with the subject. So it's like a different approach, but all the principles of making a nice photo are the same.
I have experience as well and have practiced the past year focus stacking. And PPA has a big imaging international competition. And I entered a feather that was a focus stack, and it
Oh, cool.
got imaging excellent. So
Oh, awesome.
yeah.
Yeah.
But these
feathers are-
numbers, like I've learned it by experience, but putting the numbers to it always seemed daunting. So I'm loving your
Well,
explanation of it.
I hope
It
I
makes
have
more
something that
sense.
can make it even less daunting coming up. A very special treat for everyone.
This
but-
has helped tremendously.
Oh, good. And for anyone else that's maybe considering trying out some macro after this, feathers are a great subject. Feathers with water droplets on them. They don't move, but they have a lot of detail and they're really interesting. So great subject.
And to speak to that, VPP, our group, our next meeting is our annual meeting.
Mhm.
And it's going to be a follow-up to this that you're speaking on. And VPP is going to rent lenses for everyone. And we're going
Awesome.
to practice what we're learning today. So
Yeah.
that'll be
Cool.
great. I'll bring feathers, everyone.
Awesome. Does anyone that you know of or anyone on this call shoot with Olympus OM system, or is everyone using some other system?
I can't speak to everyone. I see some Canon and Nikon. I know John switched over, but and he's on Canon now. I don't remember what he was before. Might have been Olympus.
Okay. So I asked for 2 reasons. One, because I know how much to dig into Olympus, and it's less than I would if there were other people on the call shooting Olympus. But also, if you're renting gear, for anyone that was on this meeting or watches it afterwards, it might be worthwhile to try and get like one Olympus setup to see what these specific features are, because there's a couple things that are really, really nice from OM that I actually got a message the other day from a Sigma ambassador who shoots Sony and Sigma lenses, and they're into macro. And the message was, I can't help but noticing that 90% of the good insect photographers that I find on Instagram all shoot Olympus. And that, maybe that number's inflated, right? Like it's just what they're saying to me. But 90% of the photographers on Instagram do not shoot Olympus. Like that number is reversed. It's like
Sure.
5% or 2% or whatever. So it is a niche that OM is certainly dedicated to.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
shooting Olympus as well.
Are you? Which model do you have?
The OMD EMX1,
E1X?
something like
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically everything that I describe here, other than the specifics of the menus, because the menu changed a little bit, but all the features will be directly applicable for you.
Okay.
So you're at a little bit of an advantage versus everyone else. But like I said, I'll
Okay.
speak in terms that can be applicable. So, all right, I think everyone's back. I'm going to share my screen again. Share screen, share that one, and everyone should see the spider again. Okay, and we'll play the presentation. All right, on to lighting. So as it says on the slide, light is critical for any photograph. When shooting macro, ample light is needed to illuminate the tiny details of subjects, but unfortunately, bright light can produce harsh highlights and dark shadows. So I talked about this a little bit when I talked about diffusion earlier. I want to kind of go into it a little bit more and show you now. This is not a big section of the presentation, but it can be valuable, right? Just a few slides, but hopefully valuable. And if you have questions, we can extend it as long as you need. So I almost feel bad showing this because I never photographed dead insects, but for the sake of an example that I could, make comparative, this was a good solution. So maybe I will reshoot something this summer or something. But this is a comparison of no flash, a flash, and diffuser. I'm going to zoom in on these a little bit because I don't know how apparent the differences are at this magnification on your screens, but we'll look a little bit closer in a minute. So on the left, this was my attempt to properly expose with ambient light, right? This was inside, it was like on the countertop, but this is just the light in the room. And I'm shooting at 1/100th of a second, no flash, f2.8 and ISO 800. Now I needed f2.8 because it was just the room light. So I needed a big aperture to bring in enough light to expose my subject. I had to push ISO from the base of 200 up to 800. Could have gone higher, but I don't want to introduce too much noise to get the exposure, right? Like this is just kind of what's required to expose my image. And I did my best to expose each of the three fairly similarly. In the center, I lowered my ISO to 200. I decreased the size of my aperture to f8, stayed at 100th of a second. And now I'm exposed similarly, but it's kind of lit better, right? On the left, you see it's only lit from the top. There's bright spots on the top, dark shadows underneath. In the center, it's lit a little bit better because I'm bringing light from the front, but it's pretty contrasty. The shadow underneath, if you look at the shadow on the tabletop, it's a pretty defined shape, right? Like that's the shadow of the fly's head on the surface. The bright spot on the fly's back, right behind its head, is blown out. You can't really see any color in it. It's just a white reflection. And those things, that reflection and the shadow I just mentioned, they're what we want to try to eliminate with a diffuser. So on the right, I kept the settings exactly the same, but I put a diffuser between my light source, which is the flash, and the subject. And now, as kind of grody as this thing looks, you start to see all those details in the fly's face. You see much flatter, more even light. You see a graduation of light to dark on the eyes. You see the color and the details in the green on its back. And the shadow that I called out in the center image that's really defined and dark is soft and just blends out into the table. So that was literally just taking this piece of foam that I showed you before, holding it in between my flash and the subject. And you can introduce a diffuser by attaching it to your lens and flash, like I showed, or you can hold it in your hand, or you can have somebody else hold it. So many of you may be familiar with like pop-up diffusers, right? Like kind of like you do this to close them down and they come in all different sizes. If you're out in the sun and you're getting harsh shadows and bright spots, you can have somebody just hold that diffuser in between the sun and your subject. I'm going to show an example of that in a minute as well. And it makes a pretty dramatic difference. So really simple tool, really cheap tool. I mean, even pop-up diffusers are not expensive. Can be really valuable. Anyone have any questions about these three images? Or maybe not see the difference and need me to explain it further? Because to me, it's dramatic, but to you, you might be like, I don't know, they all look the same. Okay. So here's that example that I was talking about. I wish that its focus was perfect on this example in natural light, because I feel like people are going to say, well, it's out of focus, that's why it looks bad. It is out of focus a little bit. The eyes are slightly out, but try to ignore that right now for the sake of this example. What I'm showing here, this is taken with natural light. This is in the sun. The sun is obviously above this robber fly to the upper left, shining through, and you get this very distinct shape underneath. Now the top is lit, but it's hit hard. This shape is not, I don't care about that shadow. I want to photograph the details in the eyes and the back and the wings. Like, that's what's interesting. That's why I'm photographing this subject. So what do? You bring in a diffuser. So now, yes, it's a little bit more focused, so I'm cheating a little bit, right? But the back has more detail in it. The eyes have significantly more detail in them. The legs have the little hairs on them. You don't get this like harshness in the leaf, and then that shadow is totally soft. And this was exactly as I described a minute ago, where in my right hand I'm shooting, and in my left hand I'm like holding a diffuser directly above, so it's blocking out the sun from blasting this subject. So hopefully this is a really simple example where you can understand the benefit of diffusion and of introducing a flash on the previous slide. And I think that's, oh wait, there's a little bit more about lighting. Does anyone have any questions about that? That's more the flash and diffusion portion. No, okay. So creating black backgrounds. This is kind of new content that I added to this presentation pretty recently, because I was getting a lot of questions about it. And I wasn't getting questions like during presentations, but I was getting people contacting me, or like when I would show someone a photo, they would ask the question of, they would see something like this. So this is of course a leaf, but even if it was a live subject, they say, oh, you shot this at night. And they're assuming I shot it at night because the background is pitch black. Well, surprise, this photo was shot at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in the summer outside. And you can still achieve a pure black background or a bright, colorful background in the middle of the day if you know how to control the light and a few other things. So again, I don't know what everyone's experience is in photography. If you're a studio photographer, you may have a really good understanding of this. If you understand the inverse square law, or if you take portraits, this hopefully will make perfect sense to you. If you're not familiar with those concepts, hopefully you still walk away from the next few minutes with a decent understanding. But basically the idea is, in order to achieve this look, I need to illuminate my subject with a light source, a flash in this case, but not my background. So our light source is inherently really close to the subject because it's on my camera, right? Like, with my camera close to the subject, my light source is there. But if I can get the background further away, the light will drop off before it hits the background elements. So in this case, this leaf is kind of up in the air, so to speak. Like, there's nothing behind it other than air and space for like 20 feet. So my flash is hitting the subject, but it's not hitting the bushes that are in the distance. And therefore, I see black because that light never reached them, but the light that I was using to expose my subject only hit my subject. So why would you want to do this? Or conversely, why would you want to avoid this? You might want to isolate the subject from the background. It can be pretty dramatic, looks very studio. So that can be nice. You do it by underexposing the scene. So underexposing everything other than the subject, and then using your light to expose that subject. And you can do this if you need to like test it by taking a photo without the flash on until you see a black result. Okay, so your subject's in front of you, put your camera there, set your settings however you think they should be. If you see anything, expose less. So smaller aperture, faster shutter speed, right? Expose less. When you see black, put the flash on or turn the flash on, shoot your subject will be lit. Everything else will stay black because it was underexposed. The only disclaimer to that is if the background elements are really close to your subject, they may also be illuminated by your flash. So you just have to make sure there's enough space there. And I mentioned this already, so it's really the concept of flash fall off or light fall off as that distance is increased. And I'll show a couple of comparisons here for you. So that's what I showed on the previous slide. That's the black background, 1/250th of a second, f8, ISO 200. Middle of the day, bright sunlight, pure black background. So for the next image, I held up a piece of yellow paper behind my subject. So I have my camera in my right hand, at arm's length behind, piece of yellow construction paper. Because that yellow construction paper is close enough to my subject, my flash is also reaching it, okay? On the left, the background was really far away, the flash wasn't reaching it. So if you want a colored background, you can do this in real life. Now, you can bring paper around with you, that's fine. Like some people will do that to create artificial backdrops in the wild, or you can do it in your house. But you can also use natural elements. You can hold a leaf in the background, you can hold a flower, you can bend a branch in place, and then you can add these background elements. And it can be really interesting and really easy to do. Here's another piece of paper. So put the yellow paper down, pick up the purple paper. And then last example, and this is kind of what I prefer typically. I mean, I will certainly make images like the one on the left or the one in the center, but this is what I would consider more of a natural background. So I did open my aperture a tiny bit here from 8 to 7.1, but the big difference is the shutter speed. So by slowing the shutter, I'm bringing in or introducing more natural light in combination with my flash. My flash is lighting the subject. That longer shutter time, slower shutter, is bringing in more of the ambient light. So those bushes that are way off in the distance, but they're green, they're way out of focus. So it's soft color, but I'm getting some of it because I'm now increasing exposure time. So I show these examples because when people ask me about a black background, they're not necessarily asking, hey, how do I do that? That's how I want all my photos to look. It could work the other way. You could say, every time I take a photo, I get a black background. I want the background in it. Well, this is kind of both options and the in-between. Questions? This is also applicable to outdoor portraits. You can shoot a portrait, bright sunny day, and get a black background if you control your light and expose properly. Okay, nailing focus. I talked about this a little bit when I said, why would you care about macro, even if you're not a macro photographer? Talked about critical focus. It is absolutely imperative with macro to nail your focus. Understanding when to use autofocus, when to use manual focus, how to take advantage of different tools that your system may have. I'll talk about the ones that I have, but most of them are available in all different systems, cameras. And if you kind of understand how to achieve critical focus and the tools that are at your disposal to achieve critical focus, you're going to increase your hit rate and you're going to walk away with more in-focus images. A macro image that isn't perfectly in focus is ruined. And it's really frustrating. And I shoot a lot of out of focus images, especially that I think we're in focus. And then I get home and they're not in focus and I'm really mad at myself because here I am giving advice to people saying, why not take a few extra shots even when you think you've got it? Keep shooting. But sometimes you just think you've got it and you move on, and you can't really go back most of the time, right? Like if it's a studio setup, an in-home setup, a stationary object, yeah, you can do it again. But if it's a spider or a butterfly or a frog or something, it's gone, and you have to wait for the next opportunity. So I get the question quite often of, hey, you shoot macro, do you shoot with autofocus or manual focus? And the answer is yes. It is not one or the other, it is both. It's more a matter of when and why, okay? So I'll start with autofocus. If you're a beginner in macro, in 2023, most cameras have pretty advanced autofocus, pretty accurate autofocus. Use it, okay? Don't even worry about manual focus at first, because it's going to be complicated. It's going to slow you down. You know, practice with it, work inside with it, get there, and you'll see the reasons in a minute why you want to care about manual focus. But autofocus is where you should start. Even as a non-beginner, autofocus is really valuable for fast-moving subjects. If your subject isn't going to be there in 5 seconds and you need 5 seconds to manually focus, use autofocus, right? It's what you've got. And then finding your subject within your field of view. So when we're magnified at 1:1, 2:1, high magnifications, and field of view is a fraction of an inch, it's easy to get lost. So I might see my subject on the ground or on a branch or something. I bring my camera to my eye. I don't know where the heck that thing went. I think I'm looking right at it, but I can't find it. Well, in that case, I'll tap autofocus. It kind of centers me. I can hunt around, tap, 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 and then there's my subject. From there, I can move in closer and go to manual focus. Okay, so it's that combination of using them together to get the benefit of both. And then manual focus is best for experienced shooters. So to do what I just described, you know, that combination of autofocus and manual focus, it does take some practice. You don't have to be an expert. It's not going to be years of practice to get there, but it takes some practice. If your subject is stationary, or you are not worried about it flying away or running away, then manual focus is really helpful. Pure manual focus or a combination of autofocus plus manual focus. A lot of cameras and lenses, regardless of who makes them, offer, it'll often be called like autofocus plus manual focus, where you use autofocus, but then you can twist the lens barrel a tiny bit, and it gives you a fine focus adjustment. So that can be an option as well to combine them. And then maintaining consistent magnification, such as 1:1 from shot to shot. And what I mean by consistent magnification is if, regardless of the magnification you're shooting at, whether it's 1:1 or some other magnification, there are several times where it's advantageous to have the same magnification from your first shot to your second, to your third, to your fourth. One easy example is focus stacking. You need the magnification to be consistent or your focus stack's not going to work. And everyone will understand why in a little bit. But like those comparison shots that I showed you, I wanted them to be the same. I needed the magnification to be consistent. If I re-auto-focused on every one would be a little bigger, the next one would be a little smaller, right? Like there's reasons you want consistency, and manual focus is what you want to use in those cases. Focusing tools. I think most manufacturers have everything I'm going to talk about on this slide. I don't know that there are any others, but if your camera has something that I'm not mentioning here, please speak up. Maybe I know what it is, maybe I don't, but you're welcome to let me know. So some lenses and some cameras have what's called a focus limiter. And this can be physical or electronic. So the 60mm macro has a dial on the side, and I'm going to show it a little bit later, I think. But it's a dial, and it has some numbers on it. It says 0.19 to 0.4 meters, 0.19 meters to infinity, and 0.4 meters to infinity. And every lens that has a focus limiter is going to have different numbers, but their ranges of distances where your autofocus will only search within those ranges. And they're really, really helpful, because if I am photographing something that's on a branch that's 3 inches away from me, I'm going to use that closest range of focus on the focus limiter, so I don't accidentally focus on a branch that's 30 feet away. So even though it's within my field of view, I'm saying within this field of view, only focus on things within this range. And that makes life way easier for your camera's autofocus system. In addition to physical focus limiter switches, some camera models, the EM1 series, the OM1 has it, and then some camera models from other manufacturers have this option as well, where you can electronically limit focus. So in your menu system somewhere, there may be the option to set focus ranges. So when I use the 40 to 150, that's a lens that's often used for things at a distance. But when I'm using it for macro, it does not have a focus limiter on the lens, but I only want it to look for focus in that close focusing range of, like, I think the minimum focusing distance is just over 1 meter. So I have the focus limiter set when I'm using the 40 to 150 to like 1 to 1.5 meters. So I'm, 3, 4, 5 feet away from my subject. There might be other stuff in the scene. I only want the camera to focus on the things within my range that I've pre-established. And that makes things way faster and easier and less frustrating for me. So take a look at your gear, see if focus limiters are available, and take advantage of them. Focus peaking. This one's pretty popular. Lots of cameras have it. Focus peaking is a tool that highlights the edges of your subject that are in focus with a color. So the default is usually red, but oftentimes you can change the color to red, yellow, green, white, black, whatever you choose, which is helpful depending on, like, if your subject is red, you want to use white. Right? So, but when you focus on your subject, if you activate focus peaking, you're not just relying on your eyesight and what appears to be in focus in your viewfinder or on your screen. You're actually going to get the in focus areas highlighted brightly in this color to show you what the camera is considering in focus. So it's like this insurance policy of, it seems in focus, but is it? Oh, focus peaking is telling me it actually is. So focus peaking is really popular. It is really helpful. That said, I like the next one better. So I will use focus peaking from time to time, but focus assist magnification is what you see on the image on the right. So I'm not sure if everybody can tell on the screenshot, but in the bottom left corner of my LCD, you see 7x. So that image is not how it would look after I press the shutter button. It is a 7 times zoom of the image that I'm taking. So it's really, really close up. But by zooming what I'm photographing for my benefit, I can see what's in focus. So it's just a close-up look at whatever you're photographing to double check and fine tune that focus. And it's amazing how out of focus things might be that appear to be in focus when they're at one, at natural size. So I have a button that I'll get to when I get to my settings in a few minutes that I can quickly toggle that focus magnification. On my camera, I think it's 3, 5, 7, 10, or 14 times. I can just turn a dial and increase or decrease the magnification. And sometimes people hear that and they're like, well, why wouldn't you just go to 14 times all the time? Like, be really sure, look really closely. But it can be a little bit overwhelming to be in it 14 times. So I'm usually in it like 5 or 7 times to check my focus. But if you have that feature or similar feature, definitely look into it. Really, really helpful. Know where you want to focus. This sounds silly. Like, I know where I want to focus. I want to focus on my subject. But there are specifics. This is macro. Everything's about the minutia. So I'll talk about this when I get to tips, but you really want to, like with people or animals, you want to focus on the eyes, right? We're drawn to the eyes. That's what's engaging. But it's not just the eyes. With a portrait, you might be able to get away with saying just the eyes. But with an insect, which is super tiny, you want it to be the front plane of the eyes. And you want focus to fall off as you go off into the distance. And typically, you want to err on the side of slightly closer. You never want what you want to be focused on to be missed and focus just behind it, because that looks weird. Okay, so give yourself the benefit of just focusing slightly in front of or dead on what you want to focus. And then I mentioned this earlier when there was the question about how I was kind of getting the magnifications. This is new for a lot of people when they're shooting macro. We're used to, even if we're used to manually focusing, oftentimes you'll spin the barrel of the lens, right? There's a focus ring on the lens. With macro, I'm not focusing that way. I'm setting my magnification on the lens, either by autofocus or by using a shortcut button on the lens. And then I'm moving in and out. I'm finding focus by almost swaying very gently until I see what's in focus. Now, if you're on a tripod, you can really dial that in by movement, but you're physically moving the lens closer or further away to achieve perfect focus. Any questions there? Okay. And as expected, we're 2 hours into this. We have so much more to go. So much more. But it's good. Camera settings. When heading into the field, it's best to have your camera settings prior to finding your subjects. By presetting exposure and assigning commonly used functions to buttons, you can increase your chances for success. This was one of the biggest changes and biggest benefits in my journey as a photographer. Most cameras have the ability to customize. On the Olympus OM system, the custom modes are called C1, C2, C3. On Canon, Sony, they might just be 1, 2, 3, whatever. But pretty much every manufacturer has a way to do this. And if you're unfamiliar with them, take note now and look into it for your camera. This lets you predefine not just exposure settings, but you can also change the function of buttons. You can change how you access things. You can preset parameters. You can set up a lot of stuff. So for me, I shoot a lot of macro. C1 on my camera style is all my baseline macro settings, and I'm going to get into those. But sometimes I'm not shooting macro. Well, then I just turn my camera to manual or shutter priority or aperture priority, and I can do whatever I want. But say I'm shooting non-macro and I see something that I want to photograph that's macro. I just turn my dial to C1 and all of my preference settings are already there. And that's my baseline. I can make tiny adjustments there. I don't have to change everything. All of the buttons for my macro specific functions are already mapped to places that I like. So it's a huge, huge advantage. And my camera has 4 custom spots on the dial. Yours might have just 1 or 2, 3, 4. But it also works if you do things like C2 on my dial is for the 40 to 150 with that focus limiter setting in place with some other things, different frame rates for the shutter. So say you like to shoot macro sometimes and you like to shoot weddings on the weekends and you like to shoot landscapes, like you can have each setting totally dialed in so you're not starting from scratch every time. And it's also awesome if you mess up. So even with years of experience, I'll change settings, or I don't know what's going on, and like, why are my photos looking this way? What did I do? I accidentally hit a button. Just turn your camera off and turn it back on, and it's reset to your favorite settings that you're used to. Okay, this is where people like to take a screenshot or write things down. Again, this is probably most relevant for, I think it was Ella who has an EM1X, but this will really apply to anyone. You know, you'll have to make certain adjustments for your particular model. But for me, on my OM1, I'm shooting in manual mode. And what I mean by manual mode is when I set my C1 on the dial, I say, apply these settings as if the camera's in manual. The camera should behave as it would in manual. You can also set you can set custom modes to behave as aperture priority or shutter priority. But I want my camera to behave as if it was in manual, but the dial says C1 instead. So my base shutter speed, and I'll say base or baseline a lot, this is just the starting point. My base shutter speed is 1/100th of a second. That surprises some people. They're saying, your photos are sharp. How are you getting sharp images at 100th of a second? I need a 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second to get sharp images. I'm using a flash. And when you're using a flash, you can use much, much slower shutter speeds. So 1/100th of a second, my aperture, mentioned already, sweet spot for my lens is around f8. I know that that's going to be sharp. I know that I'm going to get reasonable depth of field that I like at f8, but you would set this to your preference. My camera is ISO 200, but that is chosen because that is the recommended base ISO for my camera model. If your camera model is recommended at ISO 100, use 100. If it's 400, use 400. And the reason is, a little bit of a tangent here, but if you don't understand what that means, every camera and every sensor have an ISO that they're intended to work at. Everything above or even below that is extending the performance of the sensor, and it's going to introduce typically noise, but reduce image quality. So you can look it up. It might even say it in your camera. Like when I go to ISO 200, there's a little note that says recommended on it. So I want to stay at or as close to ISO 200 as possible. And since I'm using a flash, I can do that. Now, if I wasn't using a flash, recommended or not, I can't shoot at ISO 200 in most conditions. So I have to increase it, and you take what you get and you deal with it. And new and better sensors can certainly shoot at quite high ISOs with good results. But if you can shoot at the recommended ISO, I recommend it.
Chris, is that what
Yep.
they call native ISO?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So focus type. Oh, I'm sorry, AF target mode, single. Most cameras have lots of autofocus modes. You've got the option to have one tiny little focus point. You can have groups of focus points. Maybe there's 5 or 9 or up to hundreds, sometimes like all focus points, or you can have groups that are like a band across the center or a vertical bar or whatever. But for macro, I'm using the single autofocus point. And my focus type, the behavior of focus, is manual, but that just means that my shutter button is not autofocusing. So most people by default, your camera, if you half press the shutter, it's going to focus. I use back button focus. And if you're unfamiliar with back button focus, that just means that you're reassigning or utilizing a button on the back of your camera to do the focusing. That way, when you press the shutter, it doesn't override your focus. You can pre-focus, keep focus, and use your shutter button just to fire the shutter. And it's really cool, actually, because that lets me use that combination of autofocus and manual focus that I mentioned earlier. Right? So I know when I want to use autofocus, I use the back button. When I don't. I move my camera in or out, and I'm manually focusing. Drive mode, that's just single shot versus sequential. I use the OM1. The OM1 has the fastest sequential shooting of any camera on the market. I can shoot 120 frames per second in full RAW, but I don't need that for macro, and my flash could never ever fire 120 times in a second. So I have it set to 5 frames per second. That's plenty for what I needed to do. But it is cool to have 120 frames a second, like if you're shooting birds or other wildlife or things like that. Live view mode, SOVF probably means nothing to most of you, but I will explain the idea because every manufacturer uses different terminology here. We are used to looking through our live view screen with WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. The exposure is previewed on your screen, right? So that's why before I take a photo, I can hold it up, I can look at the screen, and it's too bright. So I decrease the exposure. It's too dark, I increase the exposure. That doesn't matter for macro when you're shooting with a flash, okay? Because the flash is determining the exposure. So what you see on the screen prior to the shot is completely irrelevant. So on the OM1, it's called SOVF for Simulated Optical Viewfinder, but it may be called Night Vision or Live View Boost or some proprietary term by your manufacturer that brightens the preview of the output before your shot is taken. So look in your live view screen settings, LCD screen settings. If there's an option to basically disable the preview of the exposure, that's what you want to do. And it does take some getting used to, because if you're not used to it, you'll look through the screen, it'll look nice and bright, you'll take your image and it looks totally different. And you're like, well, why does it look different? Well, you use the flash. So, but it's really important because oftentimes I'm in pretty dark environments, and without it, I wouldn't be able to see any preview. I wouldn't be able to focus. Face and eye detection, I don't need them for insects and spiders. So I have it off so the camera doesn't get confused. I'm shooting in RAW. My white balance, I leave on auto. The only comment on auto, even though I find 99% of the time it's perfectly fine for what I need and I can adjust in post. Sometimes if you're in mixed light conditions, or if consistency from shot to shot is really important, you might want to set your white balance to the environment. So with I'm sorry, I keep saying ISO. If white balance is set to auto, your camera might determine one white balance for the first shot at a different white balance for a shot a few seconds later. And then you're going to get slightly different casts in each image, but typically not a problem, but just a little heads up if you're relying on auto. And I find that it's fine. Picture mode is natural. Your camera might have some kind of preset processing that it applies, so I just leave it to natural, but it really doesn't matter if you're shooting in RAW. Image stabilization, there's different modes on different cameras. On mine, it's called SIS Auto, so that's image stabilization in auto. What's important for everyone here is that if you have image stabilization, I recommend using it. The only time I would say maybe don't use image stabilization is with a tripod. And the reason for that is if you're using a tripod, you can rely on your tripod to hold your camera steady. You don't need your camera to also try to apply image stabilization, because it can actually make your images look worse. But I'm never using a tripod, so image stabilization is always on. And then my camera has something called Keep Warm Color. I turn that off just because I don't like the way it looks, but you may not even have that option on your camera. That's what it looks like. So that's my super control panel. Depending on your manufacturer and specific model, you're going to have some screen on your camera that looks similar to this with your basic settings, but that's what it looks like if you want to see it. And then I also have button customizations. And this is where things get really cool, because then the camera is really yours. And again, this is more of a general comment where no matter what you shoot, no matter what camera system you use, set up your custom stuff. Like, take advantage of what your camera offers you because it really helps. So I mentioned that I'm almost always shooting in the native base ISO of 200. I can change it. I know how to change it without a button. That button's more valuable to me for focus assistance. So even though the button says ISO on it, it does not change ISO when I'm in C1. It changes my magnification for focus assistance. The AF on button is on the back of my camera. You don't have to really care what buttons are doing what, just that I'm assigning them to a function. That's for my autofocus. That's back button focus. There's a button that says AEL on it. I use that as a shortcut to focus bracketing, and I preset parameters for 99 shots with a differential of 3. We're going to get into all of that shortly, but that's preset. I decide I want to shoot a bracketed series. I just press that button and that's it. I don't have to go into any menus. I don't have to do anything. It's a one button on off. The next button is for focus stacking. So my camera actually allows me to take a bracketed series and it will blend them into a stack in the camera. No additional software required. And I can turn that on or off with the press of a button. Ellie, your camera would do that too. There's a function button on the front of the camera. Focus peaking. I already talked about what that does, but I can turn that on and off with the press of a button. And I can change my viewfinder mode. So sometimes I'm not using a flash, or from shot to shot or from scenario to scenario, and I don't want the simulated viewfinder. I actually want the WYSIWYG. I want to know what my exposure is going to be. And I don't want to go in 3 menus and find the viewfinder settings. I just press the button and it's fixed. So really helpful. And I'll show you how it's done on my camera, but I don't know how relevant it will be for everyone, but I assume it's similar on most models. So I think it's valuable to show it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second. And let's see if I can do this. This is the bear with me portion of the presentation. I'm going to change my video to this. Does that look like my camera now? Okay, and what if I do this? Did I get larger for everyone? No. It just does it for me then. One second. Well, actually, let's do it this way if I can't do it. Am I showing in like a grid view for everyone? Like I'm just one of the people up in the chat. If you hover over my box, there's 3 dots in the right corner. Click on that and hit pin, and then you'll see my screen big. Okay. I'm used to using Teams for work all day, and you can actually pin for everyone, but I don't know how to do it in Zoom. All right, so let's see if this works. So in the bottom corner, you see that it says C1 next to the M. So that means my camera's behaving as it would in manual, but I'm on C1 on the dial. And on the screen, this is what I just showed on that previous slide. If you want to customize your settings, and I'm going to see if this works, I have a gear. You might have something different. Yes. I hit that gear, and then I have all of these buttons on my camera that I can go to, and I can be like, oh, I don't want that button to do that thing anymore. So like, let's go to like a really obvious. So the record button, I don't want it to take high-res shot. I want it to do flicker scan now. And that's it. You just press it and it changes. So you can go through and customize all of these buttons super easily. And then you just, in my camera, you go to the menu and say custom mode, and then you would say set. So C1, whatever settings are in your camera right now, you're applying to C1. So I don't want to waste too much time on it because every camera is different, but hopefully if you're digging into your camera, it's something similar to that. And now, shut that off, and we'll go back to my face. Okay, perfect. And I'll share my screen again. Any questions about why you would set up, how you would set up, anything like that? All right. Okay. And so that's where my all those buttons are that I mentioned. So, you know, especially if you're not familiar with my particular model or your camera set up differently, but that's an idea of where they are. So you can get a sense. If I want to activate focus bracketing, I just, you know, pick up my thumb and press that button. I don't even have to look at the camera. Same thing with magnify. Like I can kind of muscle memory know where these buttons are, and it becomes a really good experience in the field. And then there's actually an article that I wrote about basically everything I just said to you now, but if you want to reference it in writing, you can get to that from the media page on my website. It's on the Learn Center for Olympus. But I encourage everyone, just, you know, if you shoot Nikon, go to Nikon's support center and say, like, how do I customize my camera? There's going to be articles for every manufacturer. Okay. Now, 2+ hours, 2.5 hours into this, I get to what's my favorite portion, and that is just showing you my photos and talking about them. And I hope that everyone likes this. If not, like, seriously, you can speak up and be like, all right, that's enough, Chris, just let's get to more stuff. But I'm going to show you some of the photos that I take. You may have seen some of my photos already in, you know, advance of this presentation, but I want to kind of talk about how I achieve them and point out some specifics about each one. Like, it's not just me saying, look at my photos, aren't they nice? So all my photos were taken with an OM1 or an EM1 Mark II. That's the cameras that I own. So I'm not going to dwell on that on each shot, but I will talk about the aperture, the shutter speed, and whether or not it's a focus stack, because we're getting close to talking about focus stacking. So this is a single shot, a single frame shot. And I want to call attention to that as kind of a primer for focus bracketing and stacking, because it's going to be really relevant, okay? So if it's a single frame, that means I took one photo. If it says 20 frames, that means I took 20 photos and I focus stacked them. You don't have to even know what that means yet, but just that's the difference. So jumping spider, here's an example of, it's a single frame shot. It has quite a bit of out of focus area, but the area that's in focus is what I wanted in focus, right? Just the eyes, perfect focus on the eyes. They're in the center of the frame. Everything else is soft. Like, to me, that makes it work. Here's a photo, which I'm actually going to show exactly how I made as a demo later. This is at f9, but it's 6 frames. So as I showed earlier, even at f9, you know, that's a fly. Maybe I've got a depth of almost a centimeter from front to back that's in focus. I can't achieve a centimeter of depth with f9. I can achieve maybe a third of that. So I use 6 shots to stack together and get more depth of field. And like I said, I'm going to show you this exact example later, so that's why it's here. Here's an example, also shot at f9, but this is one shot, one single frame, and you can see the difference where that fly, the whole body was in focus. Now just the head and eyes are in focus, but that's okay. It works because the thorax, abdomen, that doesn't matter. I just want the front plane of the face of this damselfly to be in focus. Again, f9, that's at an 80th of a second. And in this case, I saw this damselfly and I thought, oh, I'm going to shoot a focus stack and get it all in focus. It's going to be a really cool shot. Well, it flew away the second I pushed the button, and this is what I got. But because I was deliberate about it and I paid attention to what I was doing, I wasn't spraying and praying, I wasn't moving too fast, I was able to walk away with a good shot. This is single frame shot. I took a bunch more photos of this spider. This was the first one. Like I literally got down on the ground, took the photo, it waved at me, we had a moment, and that's what I got. So that's at f8, 1/100th of a second, ISO 200. That's important because if you remember 5 minutes ago, those are my default settings. I say this is my first shot. I literally turned my camera on, focused, and fired, and this was the result. And that's what you want. You don't want to have to turn your camera on and change a bunch of stuff and have your subject run or fly away. You want to be able to get a good shot without a lot of work. And that was a perfect example of it. But here's the first focus stack that I'm showing. I'm sorry, second focus stack I'm showing. But I've got a bunch more. But this is 25 frames. Okay, so that's a daisy. You've got maybe 3 centimeters of depth of field, 2 centimeters at least, and I can't achieve that, especially at f4.5. I need a lot of frames to get that depth. This is not easy to do handheld, and the reason is, again, we're going to get to it shortly and spend an hour on it, but in order for focus stacking to work, your frames have to be aligned. And if you're moving all over the place, your frames aren't aligned, you're not going to get a good result. So when you get up into higher numbers like 25 and you're shooting handheld, it's challenging, but it can definitely be done. Again, I never bring a tripod with me, so I'm relying on just getting myself stable. And you see Helicon Focus mentioned here. That's the software I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to demo that shortly. Here's a single frame. This was actually shot in Amherst, Massachusetts at NECCC. I was doing a photo walk, and on the photo walk, I wasn't doing much shooting of my own. Of course, I'm trying to help everyone else, and I think this was one of like 3 photos that I took on the photo walk. But again, f8, 1/60th, not 1/60th, 1/60th of a second here. And the reason why I'm shooting at a 60th of a second versus 100 or a faster shutter speed is I wanted to bring that pink into it, right? So if I was shooting at 100th or 1/25th or 1/250th, then you're going to get that darker background because there's going to be not enough time for the ambient light to expose the background of the image. I really like this shot. This was a focus stack. I shoot a lot of longhorn milkweed, red milkweed beetles. They're pretty cool. They're kind of big. They're interesting looking, but I'm often shooting them face first. And I can't help it. I've shot frontal shots of milkweed beetles countless times, but I find them and I still try to improve on it. But I was trying to do something a little different here. Really wet. So I don't even think I mentioned it as a tip later, but free tip for you is go out early. There's dew on flowers, there's dew on insects, it's colder, your subjects aren't going to fly away. Sometimes they can't fly yet because they're still wet. Good time to go early in the morning. And that was the case here. I was out early and I set my aperture to f5, took 26 frames to get the depth of field from the droplets that are closest to you as the viewer all the way to the leaf that the bug is walking on. It just pooped on the leaf, which actually adds an interesting element to the composition, right? So you get a lot going on here. You've got droplets, you've got symmetry, you've got poop, you've got color. So to me, it was successful. Okay, back to a single frame. If the concept of focus bracketing and stacking scares you, even if you don't know what it is now, or even an hour and a half from now, we're finishing up, if you're like, yeah, I see what he's talking about, but no way I'm doing that. A good way to get more of your subject to appear in focus by only shooting single frames is to put them in profile, because then they're flat, right? The focus plane of that whole subject is flat, parallel to the glass of my lens. If I took this from a frontal view, then I get the front of the eyes in focus, but the whole body's out of focus because there's depth now. There's no depth when you're in profile. So this is a single frame shot, f10. So I close the aperture down a little bit because I wanted to just eke out a little bit of extra depth of field, but I thought it was cool because robber flies are like kind of badass looking and a little bit creepy, and the black background was dramatic. So all of that came together, and this is what I was going for. So you see a little bit of softness, maybe toward the bottom of the abdomen or kind of in the deep parts of the thorax, but in general, it's in focus. Certainly in focus enough for my taste. Here's another single frame shot, very close to the default settings, right? Like, so you'll notice my settings, I'm not playing with them all that much. I adjust as needed, but I don't need to fumble with them. Aperture f8, shutter speed 1/125th of a second. People often think that this is a B in flight. They're like, well, how did you nail focus on that with it flying right at your lens? It is not in flight. So that is bristle grass, which is like the tall shoots of grass with the kind of fuzzy looking structures on top where the seeds are. And that's a furrow bee. And they're very, very tiny, much smaller than like a honeybee. And the furrow bee is kind of working its way through the bristle grass. So it's kind of suspended. So it's actually supported by those bristles, but kind of looks like it's flying, which creates kind of a neat sense. And it's shot straight down. So I'm standing and I'm pointing my camera directly at the ground at the top of the bristle that's pointing upward. But this one is a bee in flight, flying directly at me. So I have examples coming up for focus stacking from this same day where I was photographing crocuses for demonstrative purposes, and I saw some bees flying around. I was like, all right, can I get a bee just the way I want it? And the way that I achieved this is I focused on the inside of the flower. I knew that these bees were flying from flower to flower. If I focus there and time my shots right, maybe I'll get it. And this is a case of 100 fails for one success, but who cares? Like, I'm not going to show you the other 99. A little bit faster shutter speed here. Super bright out. No problem with light, middle of the day, and the shutter speed is really used to make it kind of freeze in midair. But I like that there's that little bit of motion blur, even on the one leg on the bottom left, motion blur on the wings. I could have used Photoshop to edit that away, but I like that sense of movement. It shows that it was kind of coming in hot, and this wasn't just frozen in time. Like, there's a sense of movement here. Keeping the theme of bees here, I guess accidentally, this is sweat bee. Sweat bees are really cool. They're really shiny green usually. They come in a few different colors. Very, very small, again, much smaller than a honeybee. This is 40 frames. If we do have time, or if anyone's interested, I can show this example as well. It's kind of like a bonus example if we have time though. So this is at 4.5, an 80th of a second. And I was really excited when I found this, and this is basically what I had in mind when I saw it. So excited to actually achieve what I intended. Praying mantis. So praying mantises are really good subjects for beginner macro photographers because they move slowly and they're not scared away. They're very curious. They're large and they have flat faces. So that flat face is forgiving as far as depth of field and focus go. Now, I used 2 frames here to get a tiny bit of extra depth of field, but had it been 1, you probably wouldn't be able to see much difference. Just the crown of the head kind of goes back into space, and I wanted to get a little bit more detail up there, so I used an extra frame. But this is at f9, 100th of a second. They have such a long body, you get really cool defocusing of the body in the background. Very symmetrical, kind of eerie portrait. I think I have about 3 more examples just for everyone's reference if you're getting tired of this. F8, 1/60th of a second. This is an exciting shot, not because it's Lady Beetle sex, it's because it is 1 frame. And to achieve depth of field on 2 subjects both in focus is not easy. So typically, I would approach this from profile for the same reason when I showed the robber fly, I said it's flat, it's all in the same focal plane, it's easier to get the depth of field you need. That's the best way to shoot two insects together. But I wanted a little bit of a different composition here. So what I did is, in order to get the focal plane parallel to my glass, I raised my, I agree, Katie, that spiders are cute macro. I just saw that now, if that was earlier. I raised myself and my angle, so my lens was kind of pointing slightly down, and that aligned the head of the male and the female. Had I been kind of straight on, the female's face would be in focus or closer to me, and the male's face would be slightly at a distance. So by adjusting my angle, I kind of brought them into the same plane, and that allowed me to get both in focus at f8 rather than f16 or needing to focus stack or missing focus entirely. Now, on the flip side, you can use that to your advantage. If you find insects engaging in procreation here, you can photograph one in focus to create an interesting sense as well. So maybe just the female face is in focus, and in the distance you see the male climbing on top, or you just see the male and you see the female in focus. So you can play with that, but if you want both in focus, you have a few options: focus stacking from the side, or adjusting your angle to kind of minimize that differential of focal plane. Again, two subjects in one composition. So insects having sex, insects eating something. Those are your two times where you're going to have multiple insects in the same, or multiple subjects in the same scene. There's a few other scenarios where they might just be together, but this one is like, when I come across this, I get really excited, right? Like bug eating bug, love it. F8, 1/50th of a second. So I have nice bright ambient light, 14 frames to get that front to back. So the toes of all four legs that are here in the foreground of the robber fly, the whole body of the bottle fly, all the way back behind the eyes of the robber fly, in focus, texture on the ground, lined up in the center. Like, this is what I pictured, got it how I wanted. But there's no way I could have gotten anything resembling this depth of field with a single shot. Even at f22, I just was asking for too much depth of field at this magnification. And then the last photo in the series, very, very similar scene, shot a year apart, same two subject types, right? Same species of robber fly, same species of bottle fly, but a little different composition, a few more shots, slightly different angle. You see a little bit more behind the eyes on this one. You've got some cool texture in the eyes of the bottle fly. So very similar, but kind of different approach to taking the shot. Any questions before we get to image processing? No? Okay. If anyone really wants to see more images, you can ask me. You can go on my website. You can follow on social. I'm happy to talk through anything with any of them. We could do 4 hours just on that, but I assume that is not what everyone wants to do. And thank you, Katie.
Katie said awesome images, and I wholeheartedly agree.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Loving it.
It's funny how when I first started with macro, I remember talking to my boss at Olympus, and I took a photo of like a candy wrapper on my desk when I first got my lens. And I was like, if I could just get a photo where you could see like the individual sections of a bug's eye, I'd be happy. And like, that's literally the minimum expectation with every time I go out the door now. So it's funny how your perspective and expectations change over time. All right, image processing. Like I said in the beginning, this is not going to be a full-blown demo. I'll kind of go through these fairly quickly. But what I want you to see here is what I talked about earlier of getting the image as good as you can, as accurate as you can, as successful as possible in camera. And that's what I really learned from, I mentioned John Ruth earlier, where what you see, he's a studio photographer mostly, but what you see the second that shutter is pressed is damn good. And then the final that he delivers is exceptional. And that's where you should be targeting. Don't accept less than awesome on the back of the screen and figure like, oh, I'll just fix it in Photoshop. I'm pretty good with that. Like, that's not a good approach. All right, hoverfly, shot top down. That's what the camera saw. Not a huge difference, right? So I'm brightening it. I'm doing a little bit of sharpening. I'm elevating some shadows, but I'm not changing the whole image. I'm just slightly enhancing it. And then you're applying your own personal style as well, right? Over time, that kind of comes into play. So there's your before and after. Here we see a gnat ogre robber fly eating a little beetle. Basically, it was just a little dark. So I had that background element of a blade of grass in the background, figured I would play that up. And it's just brighter, essentially. Not a ton of processing here to get it a little nicer. Grasshopper, tiny bit overexposed on the subject itself, but tons of detail. Focus is right. And then you just bring those darks back, get to enhance the texture, see the water droplets. Yeah, so not a huge difference, but I think it makes a difference, right? It matters. This one's slightly more dramatic, tiny little jumping spider. Get what species this is. I think it's like an Emerson's jumping spider or something. Only one I've ever photographed. This is in Maryland. But a little more drama, a little bit more light to the subject, a little sharper, a little more blue to the eyes, just pushing it, not changing it, just pushing it. I think this is actually the same praying mantis. I can't remember. Really exciting. Last summer, we had 2 praying mantis egg sacs hatched in the backyard. So we had hundreds of babies. And so we had a lot of praying mantises last year. It was awesome. But praying mantis before, straight out of camera, after. So here, the big difference is bringing out the shadows in the top to look like there's almost like a light shining down on it. And then just kind of boosting the saturation of the greens, but not a ton, but again, every little bit matters. Bumblebee, saving the highlights in the front, which were blown a bit, bringing in the color in the background, and then just kind of a little bit extra contrast throughout. So a little bit more of a change there. This is shot inside. This was a very, very small jumping spider that I found in the house, and then I put on some like a pom-pom from like a winter hat. So I don't do a lot of photographs inside, but once in a while, especially in the winter. This is a horsefly shot on a window. So that's on a window outside. And the window's a little dirty. It's a little underexposed. So just kind of brightening, cleaning up the dust and scratches, making it a little more presentable. And lastly, I've always loved this photo. I think I still have it up on my website. A lot of people see this and their initial thought is, oh, that's a dandelion, but it is a caterpillar. So that is a caterpillar climbing up a blade of grass, and I'm shooting straight down. And from the side, 100% it looks like a caterpillar. You would say like, oh, yes, obviously there's a caterpillar climbing a blade of grass, but from this view, it's a little different. So this was, again, a little underexposed, looks a little flat in color. The detail's all there, the focus is correct, but it just gets a little more punchy with a little bit of work. Okay, any questions about image processing? Any specific questions like how did I achieve something? I don't think anything was too complex there, but everyone has different experience. Okay. Top 10 tips. So you don't have to worry about taking notes for this section if you're taking notes feverishly, because I'm going to put a link on the screen to download these tips as soon as I get through them. So there I am, being patient. It's the worst, but I said this in the beginning and said I would say it again. Here we are. Patience is a virtue. And it's really about relaxing. And for me, this may not be the case for you if you're shooting flowers indoors, for instance, or toys or jewelry or something that's a little bit more controlled. But for me, part of the reason I shoot what I shoot and do what I do is I like to be outside. I like exploring. I like, being out alone sometimes or just finding new places. So if it can be more about the experience and you slow down and you look closer and you think slowly and you don't let your mind race, like it all kind of comes together. And even when it doesn't, you still feel okay with the day because it wasn't about I have to get this photo, I have to find something. So, in 2 words, be patient. Very closely related to being patient is approaching slowly. A slow, measured approach is critical for a successful macro photograph. And this is really important when your subjects are alive. Now, if you're photographing mushrooms or flowers or rocks or anything else that doesn't move, okay, approaching slowly isn't as important. It can be helpful to set your kind of mental state, but you don't want to scare them, right? Like, it's so easy to get excited and be like, oh, here we go. And it's also important to approach slowly, not just with live subjects, with anything, because I say live, I know flowers are alive, right? But like moving live subjects, because you can look closer, you can analyze the scene, you can see where the light is coming from. Like, don't rush. And if your subject is stationary or is being cooperative, after you get the shot from maybe a little further away, it's not the magnification you hoped for or you had in your mind when you first spotted that subject, but start at a lesser magnification that's not going to scare it. Take that shot. Maybe it flies away after that, but at least you got something. And maybe you really like it. Move in, take another shot. Move in, take another shot. Okay, this thing's going to let me photograph it. Move to the left, move to the right, move up, move down. Work the shot. Now, I showed that wolf spider that was waving in the beginning. That's not typical. The first shot is the shot, right? So take a bunch, see where you end up. Maybe you like one from the beginning, maybe you like one from the end, but give yourself that chance. I just said, move up, move down. Here I'm saying, get low. Physically lowering yourself can help you find more subjects. A lot of insects and spiders live on the ground. They live under stuff. Get to where they are. It also provides an altered perspective that can be really interesting. So most people are between 5 and 6 feet tall. That's where our eyes are. If the insects are on the ground, we're used to seeing them from 5 feet up, 5 feet away. If we bring ourselves down and take photos from that perspective, that's showing people, the average viewer, something from a new perspective in a new way. That can be interesting, and that makes for an interesting photo. Soften your light. So I talked about diffusion. I showed examples. This is my attempt at, moving from lowering yourself into softening your light, as in one example here. So I've lowered myself to this kind of face-to-face with this Asian lady beetle. I'm softening the light so you don't see really any evidence of hotspot or reflection on the shell, which can be a difficult issue. This is all about diffusion or finding diffuse light. pull back. Obviously, name of the game is magnification, close up, high magnification images. But it's okay to shoot images that aren't high magnification. There's nothing that says all photos of insects have to be super high magnification in order to be good. And here's an example where I wasn't going to get close to that dragonfly. I knew that all the dragonflies that day were flying away anytime I got closer than 2 feet. So I started shooting them from a little further away. And I was able to get a photo that I liked from further away. It's okay. But when you are able to get closer, or that's what you desire, again, mentioned aiming for the eyes. This example, the front plane of the eyes and the front of the face beneath the eyes, that's what's in focus. And it very gradually and naturally falls off as it goes away from the viewer of the photo. And it's okay for stuff to be out of focus as long as the right stuff is in focus. And the front plane of the eyes is typically what you want in focus. This is an example where if that front plane was out and everything or anything else was in, this would not be a successful photo. Mind the background. Talked about backgrounds a little bit, but that's when working the scene really comes into play. So this is, again, a very common subject, green bottle fly. You know, common doesn't mean bad. I still find them very interesting and colorful, but I photograph plenty, right? And when I photographed this one, I did not come at it from this angle, but it was cooperative. I started to notice things. I saw the shape of the edge of the leaf that was in the distance kind of mirrored the shape of the front edge that the fly was on, and I'm able to create more of an interesting composition, use the out of focus elements. And these are the things that start to come together as you look more closely. You can look more closely when you're slowing down. When you slow down, your subject lets you photograph it more. And all of that comes together to build more and more successful photos. Use focusing tools. So obviously I got into this earlier. This is just a reminder to actually take advantage of those tools. I would venture a bet that almost all of you, if not all of you, have some or all of these tools available to you on your specific camera. You just need to find them. You need to read that manual, do the research, and figure out what works for you, what you like to use. Shoot in small bursts. So small bursts can really help you. I said don't spray and pray. I said be deliberate. But why not take a couple extra shots, right? Like if your camera, you can hold the shutter down for half a second and get 3 shots, or 0.2 seconds and get 1 shot, just hold it down for half a second, get the extra shots. Subjects move a little bit, you miss focus a little bit. You can, give yourself the benefit of having extra frames. You can always throw them away. And last but not least, invest in glass. I talked about the Rainox. I said it's cheap. I talked about extension tubes. I said they're cheap. They work. They help any lens get more macro, more magnified. But every manufacturer has macro lenses. Every lens mount has macro lenses. They're all good, right? So if you shoot Sony, you like macro, look at the options from Sigma, from Sony, from Tamron. Like you shoot Olympus, look at the 4/3 mounts for macro. Whatever you shoot, there's going to be options, and usually you get what you pay for, right? The more expensive, the better the lens. That's pretty much the case across the board, and it's usually worth it. You won't regret buying the macro lens as long as you're using it. If you buy it and it goes on the shelf, then yeah, maybe you regret it, but you're going to get quality out of them. And for those of you that are interested, if you scan that code or go to the URL that's on the screen, you can download the tips. I can show it to you because I have it open. Some of you are probably there already, but that is what you are able to download. So it's just a text list of everything. But at the bottom, I threw my basic settings just in case. Again, you'll have to vary for your particular camera based on sensor and model. But hopefully that's helpful for you. All right. Okay. I'm going to take another 3-minute break because this is going to be our home stretch. I know we started 10, 15 minutes late, so I'm happy to give you the extra 10 or 15 minutes on the back if you're able to stay after, or even longer, honestly. But this is going to be like the last thing, but the biggest thing. So I'll see everybody back here in 3 minutes. Sound good? Yes, I know everybody's probably muted enough. Okay, see you soon. Kind of set up for, oh, we're recording again. How to set up for both. So in the end, you can bracket and then never stack, right? So you can bracket without stacking, but you cannot stack if you haven't bracketed. So that's where you can't really use these terms interchangeably because they are different. Hopefully that helps. I can, of course, come back to that at any time. The benefits of focus bracketing, just like with exposure bracketing or any other kind of bracketing, it increases your chances of getting the right shot. So you can shoot a series. Here's a series of long-legged fly images. Focus was bracketed, and I could pick one from the series. So that's one option. You can capture a series of images with buried or bracketed focus, and then just choose the most appealing image out of it. You can increase your chance of hitting perfect focus. So they're kind of the same thing, but maybe you're just worried that you're not perfectly focused. So you're like, well, I think it's in focus, but if I bracket, then I know I'll get one that's in focus. And most often when we talk about focus bracketing, it's so we capture that series with varied focus, so we can take the varied focus and stack them into a focus stacked image. And I'll talk about why you want to focus stack now, right? So you're going to control exactly which areas of your image are in focus. Typically, that's at least the face of a live subject, like an insect or a spider, but it might be the entire subject. So maybe the depth of field at a given aperture only allows for the head to be in focus, but you want the head and the body, or the head, the body, and the legs, in order to control how much beyond what you can get with a single frame, you can use focus stacking. In broad terms, it gives you a greater perceived depth of field than what's achievable with a single frame, regardless of what aperture you use. And you can also create this kind of exaggerated sense of sharpness because each frame is in like hyper focus. It's beyond that sense of natural because you are getting a greater depth of field. And one thing that I didn't mention here, but I should probably add to this slide, is when you do focus stacking, your results tend to be less noisy. So out of focus areas of a photo are more noisy than in focus areas. So when you're blending together all the in focus areas, you're blending together really good quality noise-free parts of an image, and then your resulting image, the composite, is therefore less noisy. So that's also a benefit that makes your images look really nice. How to do it, how to focus bracket. So remember, we need to bracket first. You can't stack without bracketing, so we're always going to talk about bracketing first. So you can do this with various methods. First, which is very unscientific, you can push toward your subject and burst. Anyone can do this with any camera that allows for burst mode. You don't need any special technology, special features in your camera. All you're going to do is take your camera, I don't know if you can see me, but as you're pushing the shutter button, you're gently moving in. This is very unscientific, but it is how I shot that long-legged fly, and I'm going to show that example in a minute. Because it's unscientific, because it's hard to do, I would say you're not going to get bracketed series of 20 or 50 images this way, right? It's very, I don't mean to keep saying unscientific, but it's like, there's a lot of luck involved. There's not a lot of room for error. So you can get 2 or 3 or 4 frames, but beyond that, you're just going to move too much. Your increments of focus are going to be out of whack. They're not going to be equally spaced. but you can do it. So if you set your camera to shoot 5 frames or 10 frames a second, hold the shutter down, move while those frames are being captured. Inherently, each focal point is going to be different from that series of frames. More scientifically, but still manual, you can use a focusing rail. And a focusing rail is a device. I have one here. I don't use it really ever, but I have it. Here's the box. So it looks like this, if you can see. It's like a long tripod mount with some dials on the side, or knobs. And what you do is you set focus, take a shot, and you can take a shot by pressing the shutter or using a release of some sort. And then you turn the dial a tiny bit, and you turn it as much as you want. And then you take another shot, and then you turn the dial a little bit, and you take a shot. And it's very specific and scientific. So you can say, I want to take a shot at the front, turn the dial, take it a little bit back, turn the dial, take a shot, and then you get a series of shots, and the focus is slightly different, but very accurately spaced from shot to shot. And you can use those to stack later. Much more preferably are the automatic solutions. You can use PC software like Capture One, if anyone's familiar with that. So I mentioned that my full-time job is as creative director for Olympus. I'm in charge of our studio, and we have a photographer that's studio photographer, and he utilizes, we have a Phase One camera, which totally different category. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Phase One, but 150 megapixels, single point autofocus, very expensive, intended to really be used in a studio environment. But you can mount your camera on a tripod, or we use a FOBA, and you basically select the front of your subject and the back of your subject on screen. So you're plugged into a computer when you're doing this, and you say, this is the front of what I wanted focus. That's the back of what I wanted focus. You press the button, it automatically calculates the depth of field and the number of shots that you need, takes those shots, and then Helican Focus integrates with Capture One, and you can stack that way. So it's like this very automatic and scientific, but very software intensive process. So probably not what you're going to use in the field or in your use, but I mention it because it's certainly a valid and successful option. Just requires some specific stuff. And then maybe a little bit more practical or available to you is automatically with in-camera technology. And Olympus OM, I don't think they're the only ones. I think Panasonic, maybe Fuji offer in-camera stacking, but a lot of cameras, Nikon, I know for sure, Canon, you can automatically bracket in camera. And automatic bracketing in camera allows you to take a series of shots with varied focal points with the press of a button. So you basically say, okay, I want to take 50 shots. I'm going to set the initial focus point, and I'll let the camera do the rest. And it's going to take steps, and they're called increments or differentials or gaps. Different manufacturers have different names. And I want to take a series of shots up to X number automatically. And that's really, really helpful. And I'm going to show you that, or at least the result of it, and maybe how to do it shortly. And then how to focus stack. You got a bunch of options there. You can use proprietary software. So OM uses software called Workspace. You can use Photoshop. That is what I'll show you today, because that's the most common. On the right-hand side, you've got Helican Focus. I'll also show you that because I do use it. And then Zareen Stacker is a competitor for Helican Focus, also pretty popular. But you can also do it right in the camera. So if your camera allows you to do it, it's a great option, but it's also a bit limited, meaning whatever the camera does, that's what you get. Where with software like Photoshop or Helican Focus, you can make some changes. That said, in camera is so freaking easy. So if you can do it in camera, like the results are really good. But a few different options basically is the point. So a sample. If you don't know what focus stacking is, why you would do it, what the heck I'm talking about, I'm going to show you. So I had mentioned this earlier. This is a crocus on my front lawn. And I know that they're kind of small, but if I can draw your attention to the top left and the bottom right, that's the first image in the series and the last image in the series. So you're going to see the most difference there. In the first image in the top left, the front petal that's kind of central in the frame is in focus. That same petal in the bottom right image is completely out of focus because focus is now behind it. What we want is the majority of that flower, the entire flower, to be in focus in our composited image. So here I've bracketed focus with the 12 frames. There we go. 12 frames. And my differential is set to 8. And differential, again, is the gap, the distance between focus. So I'm saying, okay, first frame is here, the closest point to me. The next frame is back in space a bit. We're calling that 8. That number can change. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But I don't want to dwell on it too much because it is different by manufacturer. But what you need to know is the amount of space can change. Then that amount of space is the same from shot to shot, but it moves back in space, it moves back in space, it moves back in space. So I've used the camera to set that automatically. I could also use a focus rail. I could try to do it myself, but I'm setting focus in the front and I'm moving focus back in space from shot to shot. Does anyone have any questions or need me to explain that more at this point, or do you want me to move on?
I have a question.
Yes.
So are you moving your feet or you're just adjusting your manual focus?
Yeah, so in this particular case, my camera is actually stationary and I'm letting the camera move the focus point. So I'm just pressing the button once and the camera knows shift focus from shot to shot. But you could do it by moving your feet or moving the camera. So it doesn't matter what method you choose as long as the focus point moves. But in this particular example, the camera did it for me. Does that make
So
sense?
typically in camera, I know you can choose your front of focus. Are you able to choose the back of focus?
Not with my camera.
camera.
Yeah, with Capture One, you can do it in the studio, which is awesome. But usually what I would suggest is overshooting. So you're going off into the distance. And I have a tool that I'm going to show you guys soon, which I just made like 2 weeks ago. And you're the first ones to see it. Other than anyone that downloaded it, but you're the first ones to hear an explanation of it. But yeah, first point is critical. Back point is not critical as long as you shoot enough photos to get it. So you just need to know, I need to start at the front and move back in space. Does that help you, Lisa? Okay. I think it's going to get clearer and clearer, but I want to interrupt. So there's the stacked image. So I achieved this by stacking in camera, but it doesn't matter how I stacked it, right? I took advantage of that feature that I have. I could have gotten a very similar result in Photoshop or a very similar result with Helican Focus or Zarine or something else. But this is the result of those 12 frames with focus all the way on that front pedal and then into the camera toward those back pedals. Now, you may still be confused, or you may be wondering, okay, but if you wanted more depth of field, why didn't you just shoot at f16 instead of, what was I at, f4? Well, f4 gives me a soft background. I want that soft background, but I also want the depth of field. So the depth of field on the flower itself is almost the same in these two shots, but the depth of field on the surrounding area in the things in the distance is quite different. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with shooting at f16. You like that the way that looks? Go ahead, shoot that way. But if you like the way that it looks with a soft defocus background, then you need to use focus stacking. So this is still kind of playing to the why, right? Showing the difference. Okay, now this is a little harder for me because I'm going to do some live demo, but I think it'll be okay. I'm going to show you how this works in Photoshop. So first I'll show you what we're doing. So I showed this image earlier. This is the root maggot fly. And this is the first image from my bracketed series. As you can see, the body totally out of focus. most of the face in focus, but body out. And I just call attention to this image so you can see it a little better. But here is the whole bracketed series of 6 images. And I know it's harder to see them when they're smaller. That's why I had one bigger. But you can see in the bottom right image, which is that one, face is out of focus. But here's the data I want. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the data I want is the, maybe if I, no, I don't think you can see my cursor, sorry, but the body. So I had the face, I have the body, I have everything in between. How do I blend them together? If your camera doesn't do it, but you have Photoshop or you have Helix and Focus, we can do it. So what's it look like? You already saw it, but just to refresh your memories, look a little closer. It's that. Okay. So this slide is just my reminder to leave my presentation and go to Photoshop. Okay, so here's Photoshop. And I've got images prepared already. Okay, so I've got 6 frames. What I'm going to do is just open the first frame. Everybody can see that, right? Cool. And I'm going to just delete that real quick. Okay, so that way I just want to make a canvas that was the right size. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my 6 frames and I'm going to import them into Photoshop. So I'm just going to drag them in. My canvas is already the right size. So that was just a trick to get the canvas the right size. And I'm going to hit return 6 times. And you'll see toward the right, you've got 6 layers with your individual frames on them. Okay, so I can turn those on or off, and you'll see they're not perfectly aligned. This was done handheld, so there's room for error here. There's, human error. What's important in Photoshop is, if you're familiar with Photoshop, you'll see this icon, and that indicates that these are smart objects. You actually need to rasterize them in order to get the features available. So if I was to select these layers and go to edit, you see auto align and auto blend here. They're grayed out. So you need to rasterize first, because you can't do this with smart objects. So just something that's easy to overlook. But rasterize your layers and go to edit, auto align. This is going to take care of the fact that I moved. Okay. I move a little bit, you hit auto align, and then you get this dialog box with some options. Auto is fine. Okay, auto is just going to move your image whatever direction it needs to move to align the best that Photoshop can to give you the most aligned image. We'll say okay. It'll do some work, and you'll probably see some edges here in a second. So there's what's happening. I will say that Photoshop is certainly slower than the dedicated software, but it's fine. It can do a good job. And now you'll see some edges here, right? If I zoom in, there's edges because it's rotating and adjusting, but that's okay. We're really focused on this area. We're going to crop it anyway in the end. Now you've got your 6 layers, and they've been auto aligned. That doesn't do us much good. It just gets them aligned. Now we're going to go edit auto blend. And when we auto blend, we get a dialog box that asks us if we want to do a panoramic image or a stacked image. Obviously, we're talking about stacking, so we're going to choose that. You can do seamless tone and color. I recommend using that. I don't care about content-aware fill. That would fill these gaps at the edges, but like I said, we're going to crop, so we don't need to worry about that. And we let it do its thing. And this is the last step. We just have to wait for it. And this is how you focus stack in Photoshop. It's hopefully not that hard. It's just a few steps, right? It's just bring your images in. After the bracketed series is shot, it is auto aligning them and auto blending them. And now I will zoom for you. And that's pretty much it. Okay. And now from there, you can make adjustments, or you could bring this into Lightroom. So if we wanted to just adjust the levels a bit to, brighten it up or add a little contrast, or any other adjustments you want to do, color, tone, saturation, whatever, right? Like you can process this now, but that's our image. And we've got good focus from the front all the way to here, where any given image, if I turn the mask off, I'll talk about that in a second, didn't have that. But if we turn the masks on, turn this on, we have focus here and focus here. Okay, does anyone have any questions? Because that's really it. I could stop here and be like, I taught you how to focus stack. I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to talk for like 40 more minutes about this, but
Hey, Chris, sorry, I'm
no, it's fine.
being stupid here. When
You're
you
not.
were auto bracketing, were you doing it for focus? I may have
Yes.
missed that.
Yep. So when I shot my series, I used my in-camera technology to move my focus point, but I could have used any method. I could have pushed in slowly. I could have used a focusing rail and adjusted my focus. All that matters is you capture a series of images with focus points that move back into space. And then
Gotcha.
my result was 6 images that had focus starting at the front, moving a little bit back, moving a little bit back, moving a little bit back. And then I'm taking all of those focus points. And what you can see here with the masks that Photoshop generates, it only keeps what's in focus.
Mm.
And then the next image only keeps what's in focus from that image. And the next one only keeps what's in focus from that image. Right?
Wow.
And what's cool about the Photoshop technique is if it doesn't get it quite right and you are good in Photoshop, you can manually change that mask by painting in with a paintbrush and bring in more of it if you want, or less of it by painting it out. So you get all of these layers, and you can, now, of course I messed it up, but like you can go in and do what you want. So it's nice for editing, but typically it does a pretty good job. All right, so I'm going to trash that. So we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to go to the next example for everyone. Okay, so now we're going to do it with Helicon Focus. And Helicon Focus, as I mentioned, is special software that is made just for focus stacking. And actually, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I have this example here that was made with Helicon Focus. But before I do that, I didn't really intend to do it this way. But since we have these 6 images, I'm just going to open Helicon Focus and show you that exact same thing in Helicon Focus, because now you saw it right in Photoshop. So let's see what it does in Helicon Focus. And the big difference I want to show you is you just drag your images in. It makes 6 layers, very similar. It's really, really fast. Like you saw how long it took in Photoshop. Everybody watch. I'm going to click render. And it's done. That's it. Like, what was that, 2 seconds, 3 seconds? Like, it's done. Oop, a little too much. And here's our result. Really, really zoomed. I'll zoom out a little bit. So the result is pretty much the same. And for 6 images, okay, what's the difference between 3 seconds and 15 seconds? Who cares? But when you're doing 50 images, Photoshop's going to take like 5 minutes. And Helicon Focus is going to take like 20 seconds. So it's a big difference. But to get back onto script here, let me open Helicon Focus because I just accidentally closed it. And we'll go to the long-legged fly. So this is just 3 images. Now you see these have a JPEG extension. The others had a TIFF extension. It doesn't matter. Your raw images are most likely able to be read by Helic and Focus as well. But you want to use the highest quality image you have. So I have JPEGs here. That's okay. You just drag them in. Here's your source images. And I can uncheck them and it'll change them. You can see there's a little bit of shift in alignment. I shot this one manually. Okay, so that question, I think it was Sarah who asked a minute ago, was how did I bracket? Did I bracket focus? I used automatic in-camera focus bracketing on that first example. This was very manual. I just had burst and I gently pushed in. There's a little movement. There's a little bit of inaccuracy to the amount of differential between shots, but all that matters is I have a series of shots with varied focus starting at the front and moving back in space. So I'm trying to show you different combinations of methods here. So hopefully you get that idea that it doesn't matter what method I use, it matters that I have the right series of images with bracketed focus. So to dig into Helic and Focus a tiny bit, let me jump back to the presentation for you and show you this, because I don't want you to be looking at my interface in Helic and Focus and be wondering what the heck. I'm just jumping ahead. So I've got method A, method B, method C. Even Helic and Focus's documentation on their website says you need to use trial and error to find the best results. But there is some documentation on what those different methods are doing. So method A computes the weight for each pixel based on contrast, and then it averages them according to weights, and that's how it's choosing focus and blending focus together. Method B finds the source image with the sharpest pixels using a depth map, and then it uses that depth map to blend your images. And method C uses what's called a pyramid approach based on the image representation to give what they consider, the software considers, a good result in complex cases such as intersecting objects, edges, or deep stacks, but increases contrast and glare. So there's a risk there. For me, with insects and spiders, I tend to use method C. But at the same time, it's fast. Try them all, right? Like, so you're going to see if I leave my presentation and go back to Helic and Focus, all you got to do is hit the radio button and hit render. So let's do it. We'll start with A, and that's how long it takes. And we'll go to B, do that, and we'll go to C, and we'll do that. And then we've got our A. And look at the image on the right. This is the result. The left is the source. B or C. They're pretty darn similar in this case. Sometimes they're not that similar, and then you can choose what you prefer. Okay, so I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see closer. A, B, and C. So really, really close. Sometimes the out of focus areas are a little smoother on one method versus another. Sometimes there's a little bit more sharpness in the out of focus areas. So you want to pick and choose and experiment with them. But that's a key difference between Photoshop and Helic and Focus. Photoshop has its method, right? Like it's got one method, it does it, and you get the result you get. Yes, you can mask in or out, but you get what you get. With Helic and Focus, not only do you have 3 methods, you have smoothing parameter, you have the radius of the depth map that you want to choose and to define the in focus area. So you have a lot of adjustments that you can make and really fine tune. And then that's the before, right? So before you render, you can adjust these things, but after you render, you can go into retouching, which is this tab here, and you have a brush, and basically you can say, okay, thanks Helic and Focus, but I actually wanted the area from source image 1 to be in this area. And you can paint it in and you see it in real time on the left and the result on the right. Oh, I screwed up. I actually want this. And I can paint that in. So it's pretty cool. That's why you would buy Helicon Focus if you care. But again, if you're not going to do a lot of focus stacking and you have Photoshop, start there, right? Like it's fine. It can do a good job. Yeah, it's a little slower. It's a little bit less robust as far as the options it gives you, but the result is virtually the same. Does anyone have any questions about what I just showed or why you would do it? I have more examples. Don't worry, they're coming. Okay. So I'll close that for now. And we'll go back to slides. Example number 4, and we're going to use Helicon Focus for this example as well, mainly because it's more images, not because the result is better, but it's going to be much faster for me to show you in Helicon Focus. So this is a live subject. This polished lady beetle, 16 frames, adorably wrapped up inside the curl of a leaf. Awesome scene to come across, but I needed a little bit of depth of field. And I wanted to keep that softness of the background. So I shot this, I think at f4, but I've got the face in focus, I've got the edge and the curl of the leaf in focus, I have some of that texture from the leaf in focus, and I have the whole shell in focus. And to do that, I needed 16 frames. And I wasn't sure how many frames I needed, so I shot probably 20 or 30 frames. And then when I got home, I look at those frames, I look at the in-focus areas from all of those frames, and I say, okay, this is the beginning of what I want in focus. This is the end of what I want in focus. I'm going to take those images, import them into my software, whether it's Photoshop or Helicon Focus or something else, and I will blend them together with whatever method that software provides. And I get a result that looks like what you see on the right.
So, Chris,
Go ahead.
could that have been your first image, your fourth image, your eighth image, or does it have to be the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth image?
That's a very good question. I would say it's more important for the images to be in succession. So you're typically not skipping images. So you wouldn't go like 1, 5, 7, 8, 11, 15, 20. You would go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But at the same time, it's better to have extra images on the beginning and end, meaning extra images closer to you, extra images further from you, and then you're picking the section within that sequence that has the right focus.
Gotcha.
The only thing that disputes what I just said is sometimes, especially with live subjects, they move. So you take a 50 image series and image 27, the antenna moved because the thing twitched. You can throw out frame 27 and use frames 1 to 26 and 28 to 50, ignoring 27. And that would be what you would want in that case. But it's usually images in succession. So now we're going to show Helicon Focus again. That should look very familiar to everyone. Polished lady beetle, 16 images. Here you see their TIFFs. I'm really doing that to show you that you can use whatever file type you prefer or you have. TIFFs are going to be a little bit more data rich than JPEGs are. So again, they loaded in what? 1 second, right? 16 images. I'm going to choose method B, but again, I could show you the examples or the other methods, but I like method C for demos because I like the way it builds. You kind of see it happening, right? And even though there's 16 images instead of 3, that was like 10 seconds. So pretty darn fast. That's really close. There you go. And this is a good example because on the left, you see any one of those individual frames. And I'll go back into space for you. So you're seeing only the top edge of the shell is in focus here. The whole face is out, but all of that data gets trashed by Heliogen focus. It only cares about what's in focus. And then we'll go more extreme. We'll go right to the front, or maybe to the face, which is around here. So that face is in focus, but the leaf is slightly out and the shell is certainly out. I needed maybe frame 3 or 4 to get the edge of the leaf. But here, if I was just doing that, yeah, I have the edge of the leaf in focus and I have all that texture, but the whole beetle is out. So we use all of the frames together and we achieve the result that you see on the right. Starting to make more sense? Everybody good? Any questions? So let me go back into presentation mode. Number 5, in-camera stacking. I know that this is not something that everybody has, but I want to show you how it works, that the results again are pretty similar. It's just easier. It's one less step you have to take if your camera offers it. And this one, I actually have a video, which is about 2 minutes that I made for OM System to show how to do this. So there's my 15 frames. This isn't the video, that's just a little animation. Shot at f4, automatically bracketed. So when you automatically bracket, that's what's happening. And the final image, which was stacked in the camera, but then I did a little extra processing in Lightroom. That's what I get. Okay. So I think this will play for us. Let's see. Can you hear it too? Let me see. So none of that audio came through. You didn't hear music or anything?
There's
No.
no audio. I think you have to hop out of screen share and then hop
enable
back
it?
in and click the sound option.
Okay. You're
Maybe.
probably right. Yeah, you're probably right. Let me try. If not, it's okay because I can. So desktop to share sound. Yep, there it is. Cool.
To enable focus stacking on the OM1, press the menu button, navigate over to Camera Menu 2, and then down to Focus Stacking. Press OK and OK again to turn focus stacking on. Next, set your number of shots. You can set from 3 all the way up to 15 shots. And for focus differential, you can set from 1, which is a narrow differential, all the way up to 10, which is a wide differential. And focus differential just means the distance between focus points for each shot in your series. If you're using a flash, you can set charge time, but we won't be using a flash for this example. Once you're set, press the menu button until you get back to the main screen, and you'll see the focus stacking icon in the top left corner.
So I know that everybody's cameras are different, but
Once focus
have it.
stacking
This
has
is how you
been
do it.
enabled, you're ready to make your image. Compose your subject within the camera's live view screen or electronic viewfinder and set focus. Be sure to set focus on a part of your subject that's near to your lens, the closest point that you want in focus. The series will take an establishment shot, then 2 frames closer to your lens, and the rest of the series going off in the distance through your subject. Once focus is set, press the shutter button and hold your camera steady.
so that's how fast it takes the bracketed series. So if you were to do that manually, you'd be adjusting focus in between. Like you just press the button once and it goes.
The camera will automatically compose your shots into a
So
single
this takes a few seconds
focus stacked
to
image.
stack them in camera, but not too long. But that's it. That's what comes out of the camera, right? Like it's stacked. And that's all we need to show there. But I want to show that obviously my camera has the in-camera bracketing and stacking. Your camera might just have bracketing. It might not have either. But if you leave here and you check your camera's features, and you do find any sort of in-camera bracketing and or stacking, the menus might be different, but that's how to do it. And that's kind of the benefit of it. It's really automated and really, really helpful. And even if you don't use in-camera stacking, you can use the automated in-camera bracketing and then take your photos to the computer, use Helical Focus, use Photoshop, use something else to do what I showed over the last 20 minutes or so. I'm going to blow through this part quickly because no one has an OM1 on this call, and this is very specific to the OM1, and I don't want to waste everybody's time. But this is relevant. So what I showed on screen in that video was for in-camera stacking. Again, that's very specific for certain models, but this is more general. So this goes back to a couple of people asked these questions earlier. And this is like the visualization of in-camera focus bracketing or not in-camera, just focus bracketing in general. What do you need to do? How does focus need to move? Focus needs to start close to your camera, and then it needs to move back into space over the series. So if your camera has the option to do this automatically, you just set initial focus where that gray number is, press the button, and the camera does the rest. You just have to keep your camera steady. If your camera doesn't have the option to do it automatically, you need to move focus back into space. But what this graphic is showing you is that focus needs to move incrementally and equally from the initial focus back into space as far as you need it to achieve the depth of field you want to achieve. And then the second goodie that I have for you is what I just made the other day. I was contacted by someone who also shoots with the OM system OM1 and the 60mm macro that I shoot with. And he's a retired guy in Texas who was very technical. He seemed like he was probably an engineer. And he manually went through and figured out the appropriate focus differential and depth of field that you would achieve for taking various numbers of shots at various apertures and various magnifications. And he gave me all the data, and it was presented in kind of a confusing manner. And I took it and put it into this chart with this field of view boxes kind of tool at the bottom. And I made it available in a PDF that is available, or made it available, that is available on my website for download. Now, don't get too excited to go download this if you don't have an OM1, or it'll probably work for Ella with the EM1X, but it's very specific to the camera models, right? I still want to show it to everyone today so you can understand how this works, because this goes back to the magnification segment earlier. And I'm going to attempt to show it to you in real time and the benefit of it, because somebody asked earlier, like, oh, will that calculate the front and the back of the image, like the initial focus and the point in the distance that you want? And no, it doesn't. And it's guesswork. But if you know the rough depth of your image, like, okay, this image is 1 centimeter deep. I want to achieve 1 centimeter of depth of field or of focus. I have my camera set to f8. I can look at the f8 line. I can determine my magnification with this tool. I can go to the f8 line for that magnification. This will tell me my focus differential. This will tell me, I know that I want this much depth. These are the right settings. So all of this comes together, and it probably sounds way more complex the way I just said it, but I'm going to show it to you in a second. So that's the kind of image that I want to achieve. Without a tool or without knowledge of knowing how much depth I'm getting, I could end up with areas that are out of focus. And here, I don't know if you can tell, I'm going to draw circles around them for you. even though it's in focus at the front and in focus almost at the back, my focus differential wasn't right. There was too much space between shot A, shot B, shot C, and therefore I get what we call like focus holes or banding in between shots. So it kind of looks right. There it kind of looks right. But if I look closer and closer, there's actually spaces that are out of focus in between the parts that are in focus. And that's not ideal. So using the tool, if you have the gear that works with the tool, or trial and error, you do the work with your camera that this guy did with his camera, or you practice enough, you start to realize how much focus differential I need, how much space I need between shots to get an appropriate amount of focus overlap. I know we're at the end, we're 3.5 hours into this. This is where it starts to get technical, but that's how you get the really good shots, okay? So how do you do it? Let me show you. I'm going to do this kind of quickly because I'm just going to attempt to actually show you. It'll be like the grand finale here for us. But if you do it right, I used the tool to do this. I'm going to attempt to show you how to do it with the tool and with the right settings. This is what you get. So now there's no focus holes. There's no gaps. It's as in focus here at the front. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to it. Here at the front as it is all the way at the back. So I'm going to stop sharing. And let me try again to switch cameras, plug into another camera. And this is back to, bear with me, this might not work, but if it does, it's going to be kind of cool. And we're going to change video to this one, to this one. And maybe? You're not seeing anything?
No.
Oh, that stinks. Hold on. Action see me. Now we see.
There you go.
Cool. It's just that I don't see what I want to see. It works if I do. No, I lost it again. All right, let's try it a different way. If it doesn't work, it's okay. That's why I saved it for last. But I can show you another way. Okay, that's working. So let's do this. Set my ISO really bright. I would never shoot this high, but it doesn't matter. Yay, there we go. Hey, there it is. Okay. So the way that I made that shot, and I can't do it automated the way that I wanted to, but I can give you kind of a visual I think will be helpful. So I was here, so everyone can see the focus. And if you click on those 3 dots up in the right corner of my box, you can pin me to make this bigger. And then this is like a manual version of the automated technique. I would click the shutter button and it would do this. Okay, so the first shot is here. And actually, can I do it? Oh, I can. Sweet. So this is that focus assist magnification. So I'm getting that really close look. My shot looks like this, but I get a look like this. So if I'm looking from here, I can be like, oh yeah, that's in focus on the front edge. But if I look closer, oh, that's in focus on the front edge. So that's why you want to use those focusing tools. And then with automated focus bracketing, I would set my focus here, get all my settings dialed in the right way. And again, it's going to be different per camera. Hit the button, and with one press of the button, I get this. A series of images pop, 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 pop through the subject, front to back. And that's how I achieve those images that I was showing in the examples on the screen. So hopefully that helps a little bit. The focusing tool I have here. So what I would do to use this, just to explain the concept, is I would focus on my subject and get my composition the way I wanted it to. I have no idea by looking at it if I'm at 1:1, 1:2, 1:3. I just know that it looks the way I want it to look. I then put this card in front of my camera, and whatever box here fills my frame, 1:2, 1:3, 1:4, that's my magnification. This is telling me what magnification is. I don't need to know it. This is telling me. And then I look at the corresponding line at the settings that I need to input into my camera to give me the right results. Because without it, it's a lot of guesswork. So because at least cameras that I know of, other than using Capture One, aren't able to calculate the differential automatically and figure out everything front to back, you need to kind of guess a little bit, and that tool really helps. So, but that is something, if you guys end up renting equipment and you rent OM1s or E1 Mark IIIs, 60mm macros, like, you know, the Olympus stuff, you could download that card and you could use it in the field. So up to you if you do that, but I'm going to share my screen and wrap up. Okay. So again, that's the shots that I would have taken, right? This, I was showing you manually, like, oh, focus is starting here and then it's going through. But the result, shot number 1 focused on the front of the washer, shot number 16 or 20 focused on the back of the washer, all blended together, Helical focus, in camera, Photoshop, doesn't matter. In focus areas are saved, and that's the result. And no focus holes, no gaps, everything in focus, gradually overlapping, nice and sharp. Just like with focus bracketing, I'll blow through this because if you don't have this camera, you will be confused and not care. Questions? And then 5 tips for focus bracketing and stacking specifically. So I gave you tips that were general, but I wanted to give you a few tips that were specific. Again, repeat tip, be patient. Okay, so not really an 11th tip, just a repeat because it is very important for focus bracketing and stacking. But start with singles. So when I showed this shot earlier, I said that I approached and I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. That's got this clean background. It's perched up nicely. I'm going to shoot a 20 frame series and I'm going to get an awesome focus stack. Well, it flew away. Start with that single shot. Approach it as if you're just taking a photo. You're not doing some technical thing, some special technique. You're just taking a photo and you want to make a good photo. If you achieve that, then move to the fancy technique. But don't approach it, especially with live subjects. Now, if you're in a studio, you can do it because there's no risk there. But start with a single, make a nice single shot, and then move on to your stacks. And that's pretty much how I approach every scene, unless it's a really common subject that I don't care if I miss it. If it's something that I've got 30 photos of this thing already and I'm trying to do something new and it flies away, I don't care. But in general, start with singles. Brace yourself. So obviously a little bit of a play on words there, but you want to get steady. So I shoot handheld all the time. But handheld just means that I'm holding the camera in my hands and I'm not letting a tripod do the work. It doesn't mean that I'm not bracing against something. It doesn't mean that I'm not leaning against things or that I'm resting on the ground. So here in the photo of me in the field, my camera's on the ground. I'm supporting it with my fingers, but I'm letting the ground do the majority of the stabilization. That helps me to get steady from shot to shot. And it eliminates the work that software has to try to do to align my shots, whether it's auto align in Photoshop or the auto alignment feature in Helicon that it's doing. Because the more aligned your shots are naturally, the better the result's going to be. Software is good. It can take, shot A and move it left to align with shot B, but the lighting is a little different. The angles are a little bit different. You're seeing a little bit more of the top surface of your subject versus the front surface, right? So they're all a little different, and it starts to kind of get wonky as they align. If they're perfectly aligned from the start, much better result. And I say here, use trees, big rocks, the ground, lean into things physically, literally lean into them, rest on them, and you're going to get much, much better results. And that's not just for stacking or bracketing, but it's imperative with them. But the more stable your camera is anytime, the better. Minimize variables. So before attempting to shoot a bracketed series, creating a stack of live subjects in the wild, start simple. Start in your home office, in your home studio, in the living room, I don't care, indoors, in your backyard, with stationary subjects. Here I have little nut and bolt combination. It can be Legos, it can be jewelry, rocks, acorns, pine cones, anything that's not going to move. The more controlled your setting is, start inside, then move outside, the better. It's perfect to start in wintertime, especially in Vermont. It is probably pretty cold for quite a while, right? So start inside, practice while this stuff's all fresh on your minds. Get your camera out, get your macro lens if you have one, get whatever lens you have that's going to give you the best magnification, and practice. And then when summertime hits and you're outside with far less control over the scenario, your technique has been honed, your skills are ready, your settings are dialed in, you've customized your camera features and buttons all the way you want them, because you're not going to have that luxury of, oh, I'll just set up and I'll get my focus nice and I'll get my lighting adjusted. Like, no, that insect doesn't care about you at all. It cares about moving on to the thing that it was doing. So take the time now to practice, minimize the variables, get good when you're in control, and then it's going to pay off when things are out of your control. And very last but not least, have fun. Photography for most of us is not our main source of income. Certainly macro photography in the field is not the main source of income, even for me, but probably not for you. Just have fun being outside. Oftentimes, like it says here, I'm out in the field, it's hot and I'm sweaty and I'm missing more shots than I want to admit to any of you. It's really just time outside. it's really just having fun. It's exploring. It's taking photos of things that I find interesting and then sharing them with my friends in the world. And if you can focus on that, you can have fun, then there's no bad day. So this says demos, but this is not for you because I already did the demos, and we're on to questions.
That's awesome. Thank you, Chris. I have a question regarding macro when it comes to like people or babies. I photograph a lot of newborns, and
Mhm.
people always ask about like just having some macro photos.
They
of
want
their
those details of
newborn.
the toes, and they want, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I do that, but I feel like they never come out like really like soft and dreamy like.
Mhm.
Any
Yeah,
suggestions?
so with I know exactly the shots you're talking about. Like it's the foot close up and
The eyelashes.
yeah, like
yeah.
all those things. So you have a little bit of an advantage in those situations because you don't need a lot of depth of fields. Like the softness and the defocus is actually okay for that type of photo. So you can shoot at f4, f2.8. You can use natural light. But you could also shoot series and stack them. So I would experiment with that. And that's the kind of thing where you would definitely need to experiment, not on a real baby first. You would want, let's use a stuffed animal, right? Like set up a scenario in your house on a pillow, something that's similar to how you would shoot your newborn session, and use a doll, use a toy, and practice there with comparable lighting conditions. Because I don't know if you're shooting with a flash or not.
It's in Studio Flash, so
It's studio, so using like a softbox, octabox, those kind of things. You can still use those, set up that exact scenario, but practice with the stuffed animals, practice with the dolls, and then try to apply some of the things we talked about today, with managing your aperture and depth of field, playing with some stacks, because typically newborns aren't moving that much. You do have the luxury of, you could fire off 5 frames to get a stack on a baby's foot. Like that's reasonable. But you're not going to do it the first time with a 5-day-old baby and the mom and dad sitting there on the side of the room. Like it's not going to work. Get it with your stuffed animal or with your doll first, and understand how you can manage the depth of field and aperture in a way that I showed, like with the mushroom example and the flowers. And you should be okay.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. What other questions you got? I literally have as much time as you want to answer questions because my wife and kids are off somewhere. So I'm happy to answer the questions. Is there anything you want me to go back, or anything you didn't understand, or even anything? I'm always interested to know if there was something that really resonated with anyone that was like, I was thinking about that all wrong, or I never knew that before, because, I never know who's got what experience when I'm presenting.
I'm excited to try the burst technique because
Mhm.
I've been doing it only on a tripod and then manually like
Incremental adjustments. Yeah. That is like misery to me. And that is, I know that's like my own personality and my own perspective. There are people that love to take 100 shots by changing focus 1 millimeter at a time. That is horrible as far as I'm concerned. So while that is much more scientific and accurate, using a burst technique can work wonders for you. And there's actually an additional little tip for that, if I can maybe balance on something so my camera's the right height. Yeah, there we go. So if the ground, usually the ground is where you're able to put your left hand. You take your left hand and you rest your camera on it with your right hand, because all cameras are made for righties, sorry, lefties. And as you're shooting, push on the skin of the back of your hand. Your skin will move on your bones a little bit, right? So you can fire, and here, I'll even do it. There we go. So as I'm firing, you can slide forward and you get a reasonably predictable increment. So you can get 2 or 3 photos by just kind of sliding on your own skin, but your hand's stable. So you get a pretty good sequence of shots. Again, not 50 shots, not perfectly gapped, but 2 or 3 or 4 shots that give you a little extra depth of field. And that's something, Natasha, that you could do with babies, where you can manually move your focus in space by leaning on something. A monopod is another way to do that. So you set on the monopod and you kind of tip as you're going in, because again, you need some consistency and alignment from shot to shot. And if you're out in space at the end of your hands and you do the same thing that I just did, excuse me, if you go, like, they're going to be all over the place. So very different.
So does Helicon Focus do auto align like the Photoshop does? It
Yeah,
must, right?
but it's all in one click.
Right on. And do you usually import RAW into there? You had TIFFs earlier.
So the way that, let me actually show it to you, because I told you there was a bonus sample if we had time, and anyone can drop off if you need to, because I know it's just after 1 now. But let me show you how I'm typically doing it. Because actually the way that I showed you perfectly sound, but from a workflow perspective, I'm doing it a little bit differently usually. And actually for a long time, I did it exactly the way that I showed you, and I kind of found a faster way, or more efficient, more preferable way. Okay, let me share screen, share that one. And okay, so we've got Lightroom. All right, so here's a series of images. These are RAWs. So you'll see over here on the right side of my screen, it says like CMM, CMOM 0202 ORF. So ORF is Olympus RAW file. Your RAW files might have a different extension, but you asked about RAWs, these are RAWs. So I get all my images, and what I do is I'll import them into Lightroom first, and I'll apply some develop settings to them, but I have my series. So this is the end. Oh, it's in reverse order, but there we go. Front of the series, 186, 180. Okay, sorry, I'm just confused. But I'll go to kind of the middle of my series to a shot that is reasonably in focus. Like if I was going to pick one image out of the series, the eyes are in focus here. They're almost in focus, but maybe that one. And then I'll apply my develop settings to that, but I don't go like crazy with it. I just kind of get it reasonably exposed. Like I don't do a bunch of local adjustments and cloning or anything like that. Like I just kind of get my exposure in a good spot. I copy my develop settings. So I go to here, develop settings, copy settings. Then I select all the images in my series, because like, how the hell are you going to develop that? Like it's out of focus. But I know that it was shot in sequence. So that if I apply the same settings to it, they're going to be good. So I'll select them all, right click, paste my settings. And then I know that this sequence is all pretty processed, pretty accurately, closely processed. And then I select them all again. They're still selected here. Right click and say export Helicon Focus. So these are my RAWs, but they're processed to a degree. I say Helicon Focus. This takes, it depends, maybe a minute, but on the top left, you'll see this progress bar. So as it's going, I'll talk you through it. But it takes those processed images, exports them in a manner that Helicon Focus can read. Once it gets there, the process is identical to what we saw, but I'll show you from a workflow perspective, it's a little nicer. Because you could, of course, just save a TIFF out of Helicon Focus and do whatever you want with it. But now this looks just like you saw before. It's loading my images. We'll just call it method C. Hit render. So just like any of the other examples I showed you. But more images, more depth of field than some of those others. It always looks kind of crappy until you zoom in, but then you're like, oh yeah, it's nice and sharp. And then I think if I try to close it, it's going to say some results are not saved. So I would save this to wherever, save it to my desktop. I'm going to trash it. exit Helicon Focus when you're done, working with it in order for Lightroom to import the rendered result. Okay. So I'm done. And now this result, now I'm in a quick collection here, so it might not show up, but it's in my main library in Lightroom. So yeah, it's in my main library, not in this collection, but that's how you do it. So you're just working on your raws, and then you just brings this one right back into Lightroom for you. So I find that to be kind of the easiest and most efficient way. And then I know where all my files are. So otherwise you have to save an image to your computer, wherever it is, re-import that yourself into Lightroom. It's just an extra couple steps. So. Any other questions? Did I inspire anyone to go buy Helicon Focus?
I already did.
Yeah. It's really fast and it's really good. But I know that 80% of people own Photoshop already. So just use that, especially if you're not, like, it wasn't until I started doing a lot of stacking where I was like, okay, I'm going to buy the software for stacking.
I liked is it the pyramid view where you can see the different, it's in Photoshop, it's harder to visualize when everything's in focus.
That's why I like to demo with Method C, because that visualization, even just on that spider and cricket, it's really easy to see it.
Mm-hmm. And do you use the remote much?
No. But, some people do. So, and like I said, we're talking all about macro today, obviously, but when I'm in the studio and we have Capture One, like that's really cool to see Capture One figure everything out for you, and you just press the button and it's like, oh, you're going to need 53 shots. Hit the button and then it does it.
It's almost like cheating.
It is, for sure. But the results are awesome, especially when they're at 150 megapixels with an unbelievable amount of dynamic range. Does anyone else have questions? I felt like somebody else started to say something.
I was just saying I have to skedaddle.
Oh, go ahead.
So Chris, thank you so much. This was fascinating. And
Yeah, thanks for joining.
I'm going to try. I'm looking forward, Jamie, in February to doing it as a group as well. It'll be fun.
Awesome. We'll do the raffle. I'll let you know if you won.
Okay, thanks. See you guys.
Bye,
Bye.
Sarah.
See ya.
Chris, we're actually on the 5th of February, we're actually going to be getting together as a group to practice a lot of what you taught us today. So
That's awesome. And if anyone has questions after that or before, but certainly after, feel free to ask. If anyone does end up renting any Olympus or OM equipment, I'm very comfortable answering those questions. But if you have other equipment, you can ask me and I'll answer to the best of my ability. There's a lot of overlap with different technologies, but like I said, there's some specific things that I know a little bit more about with OM. Were there any other areas within the presentation that anyone needs recapped? Or again, if you really found that to be an aha moment for you, I'm interested in knowing.
I'm really glad you went over the Helicon stuff because I hadn't done that yet and I own it. So,
Oh, great. There is a
So-
free trial. I don't know how many days it is, 7 or 14 or 30 days or something, for anyone that wants to test it out. So go ahead and do that. That's like the one thing where I don't get any kickback of any sort. I don't get $1 if you buy it, but I use it. So obviously I want everybody to know. Well, Adobe stuff, I don't get anything for either. But if anyone does buy anything, if you want to go buy a Raynox DCR 250, click on the links on my website. I'll literally get like $1, but I'm happy to receive it. And anything
Can you-
else?
can you put your website in the chat?
Sure can.
Thanks.
So Chris,
Yeah.
in Vermont, every meeting that we have, we give a $100 scholarship to current members who are participating, and it's to be used for furthering their education.
Sure.
So I'm just going to pop up our little thing and see who gets it. Can we see it okay?
Good luck to you all. Yeah, we can see that.
Oh,
oh,
Oh, so close. You got to screenshot that
Oh.
and show Sarah how close she was.
Natasha!
Oh, no. Nice. Awesome.
Congratulations.
Okay, I don't know how to unshare.
Oop, you got it. Unshared.
I'm excited to go back into Helicon and compare what I've done in Photoshop and see if there's a
Yeah.
difference.
The one thing I didn't say, because I am using Helicon because I own it, right? Like I do find that it's superior to Photoshop, especially on speed, but results kind of comparable. It is nice that you have the different parameters and adjustments in Helicon versus Photoshop. But even if you look on my website, or I think the Mantis shot that I shared, sometimes I prefer Photoshop. And the times where I prefer Photoshop is not necessarily for like the auto blend method that I shared. It's more for manual. Like I have two photos and I want to take this piece from photo A and that piece from photo B, and I'll manually put them together. So there's the more tools you have, the more you understand them, the more you can pick and choose what's right for you. But Helicon is really good. And I've never used Zareen Stacker. I know that it's the main competitor for Helicon. I know lots of photographers that use it. There doesn't seem to be a strong preference of one versus the other. I think they're virtually the same kind of thing. But is there anything else? Did I make anyone think in a new way? Like the aperture section, I always wonder if that is as shocking as I think, where f/16 is still producing a pretty short amount of depth of field and reasonable bokeh. Yeah, because when I say people would never shoot at f/16, because who would want to do that? Anything like that for anybody? I'm always curious when I have this captive audience. Like, I don't know who you guys are. I don't know if you've ever used a camera before, but I can only assume you're very talented. Okay. There was one other thing I was going to say about. Well, that's also a misconception a lot of times with lenses. Most of us look at lenses, and if we see 50 millimeter f1.2, like, oh, that's good. Right? Like f1.2, it's probably expensive. It's really bright. Well, why is your lens f2.8? That's crappy, right? f2.8 is not good, but it is. I never shoot at f2.8. I don't need f2.8. I don't need f3.5, really. Like I'm usually shooting, as you saw from my shooting information, f7 to f9. That's kind of the wheelhouse.
Awesome. Awesome.
All right.
This
well,
was so great. Thank you so much for your time, Chris.
yeah, thank you all. I mean, that's honestly not
you.
even saying facetiously. This is, I wouldn't rather spend my Sunday morning doing anything else.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. And again, reach out to me anytime. My link's there, social media. I'm pretty accessible. So
Chris, I did just send you an email asking for your address. If you could just respond back with your mailing address, it'd be great.
you got it.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
ya.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.